Hello, Emilio. Good afternoon.
Hello, how are you, Kiko? A big hug. Good afternoon.
We have already finished the year on December 28th, and this is the last workshop, the extraordinary workshop that we usually hold in life. This year's workshop is titled Great Consciousness Lessons from Oscar Wilde, Nietzsche, Amalia Domingo, Federico Garcia Lorca, and Antonio Machado. Thank you very much, Emilio, and happy holidays.
Thank you very much, Kiko, and happy holidays to you too. And to all of you friends, I hope you are making the most of this Christmas season in the way we shared during the December monthly meeting. I sincerely hope that is the case. And it is magnificent that we have the opportunity to approach the new annual cycle by sharing this extraordinary Christmas workshop on this date, which is also already traditional for the extraordinary Christmas workshop, which is December 28th, the Day of the Innocents, the day of each person's commitment to live from non-harm, to live without violence, in non-violence, that principle which, from a spiritual perspective, was already present in the Upanishads over 2,500 years ago, to live without violence. And in that context, we are going to talk today. We will have a conscious meeting today with 5 memorable people, absolutely memorable, as Yakiko has commented and shared. We are going to hold a 2000 awareness meeting with the life and works of Friedrich Nietzsche, Federico Garcia Lorca, Oscar Wilde, Antonio Machado, and the perhaps lesser known, but no less significant from a spiritual perspective, Amalia Domingo Soler. In that sense, friends, you already know that the program we are going to develop is my presentation of approximately a couple of hours, where I will unfold the fundamental contents of the workshop. You will receive that content in detail tomorrow in the text that, along with the video, Ekiko will share with you. We are talking about around 30 pages, where we provide a sort of summary journey through the lives and works of all these characters. So there, you will have material for in-depth study and reflection. And for my part, in this presentation, I want to start by indicating that certainly, from a historical perspective, there have been many writers, essayists, poets, novelists, and playwrights who, through their work and also, of course, through their lives, have conveyed and bequeathed to us valuable lessons in the realm of consciousness. And this happens even when it comes, as we will verify today, to authors who are not considered by the general public to have a spiritual profile, but rather the complete opposite. But the reality is that by analyzing, as I said, his life and his work, we can see that spirituality and consciousness have indeed been very present in his life. In this workshop, we have chosen 5 of these memorable figures, both for what each one represents on their own and for the added value that a joint analysis of their teachings and contributions brings. As a common note, of course, they all were born throughout the 19th century and passed away during the first 4 decades of the 20th century. This is a distinctive note of the 5 that unites them from a chronological perspective and arranged precisely chronologically by their date of birth. As Kiko has already indicated in the title, and I too, but now arranged in the presentation that I will make in this introduction, from the perspective of her chronology, the first of these figures to mention is Amalia Domingo Soler, who was born in 1835 and died in 1909, one of the best writers and one of the best poets of late 19th century and early 20th century Spain, who stood out for her simplicity, social commitment, defense of women's rights, and promotion of what was then called, and is still referred to today, as the spiritualist movement. We will see in due time what this is and what it means in the context of the life and work of Amalia Domingo Soler. From a chronological point of view, the second of these figures to highlight is Friedrich Nietzsche. He was born in 1844 and passed away in 1900 during the transition between the 19th and 20th centuries. He must be considered a philosopher, poet, musician, and a great philologist, creator of a body of work that is as vast as it is intense, offering a significant worldview, and a style that has undoubtedly exerted a profound influence on contemporary global thought, both throughout the 20th century and into the present 21st century. Chronologically, by date of birth, Oscar Wilde appears in third place. He was born in 1854 and died, like Nietzsche, in 1900, during the transition between the two centuries. He is considered a writer, poet, and playwright who, despite being of Irish origin, was a celebrity in England during his time, with his fame spreading throughout Europe and much of the world due to his literary talent and sharp wit. Fourthly, chronologically, Antonio Machado appears, who was born in 1875, died in 1939, and was a thinker and poet from my land, a fellow countryman like Amalia Domingo Soler, a Sevillian, who stood out for his clear contemplation of existence, his appreciation of popular wisdom, and his commitment to humanity filled with transcendent meaning, as we will have the opportunity to confirm. And finally, chronologically, Federico Garcia Lorca, born in 1898 and murdered in 1936, is considered the most influential and popular poet of 20th century Spanish literature. As a playwright, he is regarded as one of the peaks of Hispanic theater of the past century, achieving well-deserved international recognition from his native Granada. We are talking, therefore, friends, about 5 brilliant human beings who experienced a not very prolonged existence. The average age at which they passed away, as you may have noticed from the date I provided, is just over 55 years. They did not have a particularly long life in terms of what characterized the 5 of them on average, but although it was not a very prolonged life, it was, however, an enormously fruitful one, showcasing the genius and creativity that brought out the best in each of them, and, it must also be noted, the worst of the society in which they lived. And this is a kind of paradox that occurs in the lives of the 5. Being authentic geniuses, immensely creative, conscious, and humane individuals, they brought out the best in themselves. However, the society in which they lived responded with the exact opposite, bringing out the worst in itself and making each of them pay very clearly for not conforming to the grinding wheels of the herd. This is another characteristic of the 5, who were generous, conscious, and brave people that did not subscribe to those belief systems, to those grinding wheels that, from the perspective of manipulating the collective unconscious, become the grinding wheel of the herd. And they had to pay a very high price for it. The case of Federico Garcia Lorca was tremendous. He paid with his assassination. In the case of Antonio Machado, it was exile. In the case of Oscar Wilde, it was prison. In the case of Amalia Domingo, it was defamation. And in the case of Nietzsche, it was madness, because his genius, in the face of social harassment, effectively led him, so to speak, to madness, leading him to dementia. It will be precisely because of this last one, Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher, that we will begin the development of this presentation. And this is not by chance, but because Nietzsche's teachings on the death of God, the evolutionary condition of human beings, and the phases of human self-transformation define the framework in which the contributions of the other 4 naturally fit and intertwine, who, along with Nietzsche, will be highlighted as figures worthy of our conscious memory. Therefore, dear friends, we begin this journey through Friedrich Nietzsche. The first thing to note is that if we look at most biographies of Nietzsche, he has been a figure that has fascinated me since I was very young. Here at the back to my left is his complete works. And there is a very important number of biographies or studies about his life, most of which categorize Nietzsche as an atheist, emphasizing his so-called atheism. And it is true, friends, that Nietzsche vehemently rejects the monotheistic God, shaped, promoted, and disseminated by Catholicism and other churches, but it is also absolutely true that he does not deny the divine and divinity at all. Indeed, 2009 is a divinity that is taken out of the narrow confines of dogmas and cults, of beliefs and rituals, to expand it towards a holistic and transformative perception, a vision of the divine action that must be qualified as genuinely revolutionary, and that, from the will, this will to which he gave so much importance, prepares us for something that he also understood very clearly: the decline of contemporary society. And far from being depressed by this decline that he had already announced, he sees and announces it with complete clarity. Far from being depressed by it, he understands it as an inevitable and relevant step for the emergence of the new humanity. A new humanity, a new human being that he translated into Spanish titles as Superman, a Superman that encompasses both an individual dimension, the metamorphosis of each person, and a collective dimension, the transfiguration of humanity as a whole. When the reading and examination of Nietzsche's work are stripped of stereotypes and prejudices and filled, as it interests us, you and me, with sensitivity, it becomes obvious that spirituality pulses and shines in the work of the great German philosopher. However, it does not do so, as I have just shared, from a hollow, dogmatic, or ritualistic religiosity, but from a perception of the divine and divinity that breaks with the molds imposed by a society that, as he says, has killed God. And it is thus that it brings us closer and calls us to a new understanding of divinity that transcends the subjective and the particular, overcomes nihilism, sweeps away the race of slaves that extend across the world, and transforms that divinity into an affirmation of freedom, a will to power, a configuration of a new evolutionary stage, and a reason for being and support for a new humanity, because this is what we find in Nietzsche's work, due to his vehemence, a certain disdain for what he considers the last men, as we will see now, for what he considers the race of last slave men, because he understands that we are called to transform ourselves into supermen, and from that vehement disdain, which sometimes makes his way of addressing his works and the public even insulting, there is, I insist, a divinity that must be capitalized, which is an affirmation of freedom, which is the will to power, which is the configuration of a new evolutionary stage, and is the reason for being and support of a new humanity, that of the Übermensch, as we have mentioned in both, the individual and the collective, as we will now have the opportunity to verify. And as a backdrop to all of this, it is also important to highlight a kind of attraction and repulsion towards the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. That kind of attraction but repulsion, attraction for its background, but repulsion for the manipulation of its figure, for what the manipulation of its figure has entailed. This binomial of attraction and repulsion is fundamentally found in three major works by Nietzsche, whose reading is absolutely advisable, especially the first one I will not mention. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is perhaps the sublime work of Friedrich Nietzsche, which he himself configures as a fifth gospel, like a gospel to be added to the four canonical gospels. And alongside Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it is necessary to reference another work, Ecce Homo, where Nietzsche presents his own self-portrait in this highly significant appellation. And also finally, The Antichrist, his last work, which is therefore a posthumous work because it is published even after Nietzsche has passed away, as we mentioned, in the year 1900. And this title of The Antichrist is one that, as the title itself suggests, speaks volumes about the attention from a binomial attraction-repulsion that the work of Friedrich Nietzsche has in relation to Christ Jesus. It is therefore, friends, a colossal baggage in terms of clearly spiritual content, from which, for the purposes of this workshop, we will fundamentally extract three major contributions. The aforementioned death of God that contemporary society brings, the evolutionary condition of the human being, and the three great phases of self-transformation on which this evolution of humanity from man to Superman is based. We are going to start with the death of God. We find this calling or warning from Friedrich Nietzsche about how this society is killing God in several works. But in particular, what the German philosopher tells us in a work he wrote in 1882, which is The Gay Science, is very significant. Specifically in sections 108, titled New Struggles, in section 125, which is called The Madman, and in section 343, named What Happens to Our Joyful Serenity. In The Madman, in section 125, is possibly where Nietzsche most clearly defines this death of God and how it is well reflected in the work. I will allow myself, you have it in the text you will receive tomorrow, to read it literally. Nietzsche says, "Through the madman in The Gay Science, did you not hear of that madman who ran through the public square, with a lantern lit in broad daylight, crying out without ceasing, 'I seek God, I seek God'? Since many who did not believe in God were present, their shouts provoked laughter. 'Have you lost it?' said one. 'Has it gone missing like a child?' Asked another, 'Has he hidden? Is he afraid of us? Has he embarked? Has he emigrated?' And these questions were indeed accompanied by laughter in the choir. The madman confronted them and fixing his gaze on them exclaimed, 'Where is God? I am indeed definitely going to tell you, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. God is indeed dead, remains dead, and we have indeed killed him.' Upon reaching this point, the madman fell and looked back at his listeners. They also fell silent, looking at him in astonishment. Then he threw the lantern to the ground, causing it to extinguish and shatter. 'It comes too soon,' said the madman. 'Then it comes too soon. My time has not yet arrived.' This immense event is still on its way. It is coming. Moreover, it has not yet reached the ears of men. It is beautiful, wonderful, the way Nietzsche synthesizes this killing of God that we have all killed together. And obviously, friends, as we have insisted in many monthly meetings, the death of God mentioned by Friedrich Nietzsche has nothing to do with the death of an anthropomorphic God. It is not that we kill a God in a physical or literal sense. It is not that we kill a God, that we strangle a bearded God who is beyond Jupiter. The perception of divinity in Nietzsche, as we mentioned before, is much deeper. No. What this is about regarding the death of God is the death of the idea of God, that is, the banishment and expulsion of any vision and notion of transcendence from personal and social life, which is precisely what Nietzsche already observed in his society, what he predicted for the future, and what we are witnessing in the present moment, a society blind to the transcendent, absolutely clinging to the superficial, the evanescent, and the material. And it is also found that this death of God that Friedrich Nietzsche announces is very important for us to consider at this moment, as it is directly connected to another announcement made by Nietzsche. Nietzsche not only speaks to us, not only warns us, not only announces the death of God in the sense of the expulsion of the transcendent from personal and social life, but also tells us that this will inevitably be accompanied by a gigantic dystopian wave, generated and stirred by a deep and powerful current, as he writes, of rampant materialism, which has its reason precisely in having killed God. And with spirituality and transcendence expelled from our lives and society, what remains, friends? Does that illness mentioned by Rudolf Steiner in How Can I Find Christ still exist? That illness, which consists of the denial of the divine, the inability to perceive divinity, which, as Steiner warns us, is a real and authentic physical defect, an illness of humanity that has killed God. A disease, Steiner humorously says, that doctors cannot cure, happens to be one that they themselves often suffer from, and it also makes us suicidal. We are suicidal because we kill a part of ourselves chaining ourselves to a perishable aspect of being human, forgetting our imperishable dimension. The human being is a perfect conjunction of essence and appearance, of being and existence, of the imperishable and the perishable. But this society that has killed God banishes, expels, and denies the essential part, the imperishable part, the part of the being of the human being, which leads to its own suicide, becoming subhuman, and turning these human beings into the last men. Although Nietzsche is convinced, which is why he uses this very term, he is convinced that these last men will cyclically give way to 2009, to the emergence of that Superman, to the emergence of a new humanity. In this sense, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the great work of Nietzsche, which we have already mentioned in its prologue, the German thinker asserts this conviction that the human being is something that must be overcome. And it shares, I read literally, that the human being is a stretched rope. Just look at how graphic a way it is to express it. It is said to be a rope stretched between the animal and the overman, a rope over an abyss, a dangerous crossing to the other side, a dangerous walk, a dangerous look back, a dangerous shudder, and not stopping. The greatness of the human being lies in being a bridge and not a goal. What can be laughed in man is that he is a transit and a sunset. Do you not see yourselves reflected in these words of Nietzsche? Is Friedrich Nietzsche not speaking about many of you, about many, about all of us? And from there, Nietzsche tells us that on the journey from man to the overman, the human being goes through three major phases of self-transformation. We find it indeed precisely in the first speech of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, exactly. The first evolutionary stage of the human being is the camel. What is the camel? It is the must. I have to live life subordinated, subjected, disempowered. I must, I have to, always attentive to what others say, responding to the influences of others. I must, I have to. Nietzsche tells us that we are called to overcome this archetype of the camel and transform ourselves into lions. The lion is the I want, the I want. The lion is the human being who throws themselves into the world, who does not settle for subordination, for being there subjected, obligated, belittled, dependent on what others say, begging for the approval and the okay from others. The lion says enough, and leaps to conquer the world, leaps in every sense, in the sense of success, of fame, of manifestation in pleasures, of manifestation in the economic. But the important thing is that it breaks away from that submission, from that I must, from that I have to of the camel, and in that way it becomes a lion. But of course, the lion, no matter how much it tries, Nietzsche tells us, to achieve happiness with the courage with which it confronts the world, will not succeed, because true happiness is not found in the external. Therefore, Nietzsche calls us to a new self-transformation. If it speaks to us about moving from camel to lion, the lion must also be surpassed on the path to the overman. And it must be overcome by transforming ourselves into children. He speaks to us about innocence. Today being the day of the innocents, he speaks to us about a new beginning. He speaks to us about a wheel that moves by itself. He even talks to us about the game of creation, which he refers to as the child. It is curious that what is written in the late 19th century has so much to do with what we often discuss now regarding the transformation of that inner child to which so much reference is made. And these reflections, along with those made regarding the evolutionary condition of the human being, of man, who is a bridge to the overman, must be linked to that figure that Nietzsche had in that binomial of attraction and repulsion that is Christ Jesus, and on this occasion with the expression found in the Gospels of Christ Jesus, which is the Son of Man, because that Son of Man whom Jesus of Nazareth speaks of is very similar to the one that Friedrich Nietzsche claims as his own centuries later. For the Son of Man is related to the dimension of individual transformation and the rebirth, as well as to the dimension of collective transformation, the end of this human generation as a step towards a new humanity. And from the perspective of this transformation, and fundamentally in what is the individual transformation based on this rebirth, that is evidently a crucial matter. Here, Federico Garcia Lorca stands out strongly for his contributions, for the finesse of his contributions, as the second of the great figures we bring up in this extraordinary Christmas workshop. So, let's move on to this second great character. Regarding Federico Garcia Lorca, I want to start by referencing a well-known contemporary Spanish actor named Carmelo Gomez. He is a recognized and award-winning Spanish actor who was born in León. In 1962, a long time ago, Carmelo Gomez showed great interest in Federico Garcia Lorca, which has led him to prepare a theatrical show titled A Vueltas con Lorca. He has been touring the Iberian Peninsula throughout the past year 2022, and also during this year that is now concluding, 2033. In the interviews conducted with Carmelo Gomez, we can read things from his own words that I will briefly summarize because they point very well to the spiritual dimension of the life and work of Federico Garcia Lorca. Carmelo Gomez tells us that Lorca finds through his mother a redeemer that he lacks. He was fascinated by Jesus Christ and never stopped believing in him. It is a different matter that he distanced himself from the church and its structures. Friends, this distancing is reflected in part of Lorca's work, particularly in the famous play The House of Bernarda Alba and various poems that express his critique of the monastic world. But, as Carmelo Gomez continues to say, in the Casidas and in the Gacelas, poems so named in homage to all the Arab poets of Granada, there is an extraordinary spirituality. Lorca's misunderstanding of the monastic world is very explicitly reflected in some of his youthful writings, collected in the book Impresiones y Paisajes, which is from the year 1918, and especially in a set of texts inspired by Lorca's visit to the Cartuja de Miraflores in Burgos. These writings, a large part of them, I insist, from his youth, have fueled the belief in the irreligiosity of Federico Garcia Lorca after his period of adolescent devotion. However, pointing again to what Carmelo Gomez comments, the truth is that Federico maintained his spiritual convictions until the end. That is to say, Federico Garcia Lorca remained steadfast in his deep spiritual convictions until his infamous assassination on August 18, 1936. Convictions that are grounded in a mature spirituality, as described by Nietzsche, a spirituality that is foreign to cults, rituals, and dogmas, and is intimately linked to his admiration for Jesus Christ. There is a phrase that we find in the third volume of his complete works, published by the Aguilar Publishing House in Mexico in 1991. There is a phrase that summarizes very well what I am conveying. Lorca says there is something in our soul that surpasses everything that exists. There is in our soul, in yours, in mine, in theirs, something that surpasses everything that exists. That spirituality, that transcendence, beyond structures, beyond dogmas and rituals, is strongly woven throughout the entire work and life of Federico Garcia Lorca, and it was undoubtedly this spirituality of Federico that, through a letter, led him to make an intimate confession to his friend and guitarist, Regino Sainz de la Maza. Federico and Regino were two fundamental figures of the generation of 27, and their intense friendship resulted in a beautiful correspondence that we still preserve, located at the Fundación García Lorca in Madrid. And thanks to this correspondence, we know of a letter that in 1922 Garcia Lorca wrote to Sainz de la Maza, and I cannot help but read you a part, an important excerpt from it. You will also, Have it. In the text you will receive tomorrow. Federico tells his close friend Regino, I have discovered something terrible. Don't tell anyone. I have not been born yet. The other day, I was carefully observing my past. I was sitting in my grandfather's armchair, and none of the dead hours belonged to me, because it was not I, with a capital I, who had lived them, nor the hours of love, nor the hours of hatred, nor the hours of inspiration. There were 1,000 Federico Garcia Lorcas lying in the attic of time. And in the Almacén del Porvenir, I contemplated another 1,000 Federico Garcia Lorcas neatly stacked on top of each other, waiting to be filled with gas to fly aimlessly. It was a terrible moment of fear. My mother, Lady Death, had given me the key to time, and for an instant, I understood everything. I live in borrowed time. What I have inside is not mine. We'll see. If I am born, my soul is absolutely unopened. For good reason, I sometimes think that I have a heart of tin. These words in this letter from Federico to Regino are impressive, and I believe it is also a provocation, a call to each and every one of us. Notice, it was at this moment that he realizes that he has really not lived, that there have been some Lorcas who are his little selves, manifesting in many ways, but that his true self has not lived. And he says it was a terrible moment of fear, a terrible moment of fear. Haven't you sometimes felt this fear precisely when realizing a life that we have clung to, something that we really are not, and that what we truly are has not yet been born, has not yet emerged? My mom, Lady Death, had given me the key to time, and for a moment, I understood everything. I live borrowed. What I have inside is not mine. We'll see if I am born. My soul is absolutely unopened. This is tremendous and connects enormously with that rebirth we referred to earlier. Because when we read this letter from Lorca, it is relatively easy for us to realize that we truly believe we live, and yet we do not live. Really, friends, we are dead. We are the living dead, a kind of zombies wandering around here, as he also says, filled with gas, but going nowhere, and we believe that we are living. But it's a lie. We are the living dead, in quotes. We are zombies and death. We must die to death. We have to die. And to die to death is to resurrect in life, and to resurrect in life is to be born again, to transform oneself by leaving behind the camel and leaving behind the lion, transforming into that child that Nietzsche speaks of. It is about bringing to us the rebirth that Jesus Christ speaks of so clearly in the Gospel of John, which recounts this profound story that I cannot hold my tongue. I am going to read it in full because it is not very long, and this profound dialogue between Christ Jesus and Nicodemus is immensely illustrative. The Gospel of John tells us, I repeat, chapter 3, verses 1 to 10, that there was among the Pharisees, who were the priests of that time, a man named Nicodemus, who was a leader among the Jews. He went to see Jesus at night and said to him, Master, we know that you have come from God, because no man can do the miracles that you do if God is not with him. Jesus answered him, Truly I tell you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. In response, Nicodemus asks, How can someone be born again when they are old? He was already of advanced age. He cannot enter his mother's womb and be born a second time, can he? In response, Jesus said to him, Truly, Nicodemus, I assure you that unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. What is born of the flesh is flesh, and what is born of the Spirit is spirit. Do not be amazed that I said to you, you must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and although you can hear it, you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. This is how it is with everything that has been born of the Spirit. So Nicodemus asked him again how these things can happen. And Jesus answered him, "You are a teacher of Israel, and yet you do not know these things?" Friends, we must be born again. Federico Garcia Lorca feels this deeply. He clearly perceives that he has lived on borrowed time because he walks through life like a living dead person. What he has inside does not belong to that small self. It is something much more transcendent, and he realizes that it is not manifesting in his life. That is why he also tells us that my soul is absolutely unopened. It is a kind of self-recognition that is precisely also the door, the way to avoid self-deception, the gateway to self-transformation that Garcia Lorca undoubtedly experiences in the years when, although he dies very young, due to his assassination at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, he can unfold in those few years. Friends, we must be born again. Nietzsche's Superman, and breaking this dynamic of a soul that remains unopened, calls us, invites us precisely to be born again. And being born again is a practice of life. Being born again is not about intentions. Being born again is not about thoughts. Being born again is not about emotions. Being born again is not about goals we can set intellectually. Being born again is a practice of life. It is about bringing our true being into our lives, what we really are, so that our perishable existence is fully imbued with our true, imperishable being, and manifesting it in our lives and in our works. For as Jesus tells us in the Gospel of Matthew 7:16, "You will know them by their fruits. You will know them by their fruits." And the new way of life must be of such depth, it must have so much content and implications, that it signifies a rebirth of water and spirit. And this rebirth of water and spirit has direct implications for letting one life die, a life in which we have identified ourselves with what we are not. In the message of Nietzsche, in the message of Lorca, and also in the characters we will see next, this becomes crystal clear. We need to take a step forward, 2009. We have to stop identifying with our personality. I am not Emilio, and you are not each one of you, and you are not your personality. We must go beyond. The great Sufi mystic said it well. God is I, and I am God when I cease to be I. You must cease identifying with your small self, with your physical, emotional, and mental self, and the personality associated with it. And not only that, we must disidentify from our little self. And we must disidentify ourselves, disidentify from this world, And perhaps the first thing is a way of living that goes beyond the small self. You have reflected on this more than once, but I draw your attention to this. Second, it is not only necessary to go beyond, not only to disidentify from the small self and the personality associated with it, not only to disidentify from the current Emilio, but we also need to break ties with this world. This world, friends, is not ours. It is not ours. Certainly, through many incarnations, your soul and mine have contributed to making this world what it is. But of course the soul evolves, and now you and I know that what beats in our hearts and what shines in our souls is something else. It is a new humanity. It is another world. And we realize, or we should realize, that this world is not ours. This ephemeral world, this world whose end is announced, and that when we talk about the world, we are not talking about the earth, please, nor about Mother Earth, nor about nature, nor about life, nor about existence. No, this world is this system. This is very clear in Christianity, in the early passages of Christianity, in the primordial texts. This world is this system, this socio-economic system, this political and institutional framework that is precisely subjected to the socio-economic system, etc., etc. This world is not ours. Being born again means dying to the identification with your small self and means dying to the identification with this world. We must go beyond, and in that beyond, the practice of life is fundamental, a coherent practice of life, coherent, so that, returning to the letter that Lorca addressed to Saidelamaza, we can be reborn by opening the soul. And this letter from Federico Garcia Lorca also brings with it, as can be understood from everything I have just shared, that radiant fragrance that appears in the work of St. Augustine of Hippo, which I extract from his book, Confessions, Book 10, Section 27, calling us to reconnect with our most intimate and true self. Because being born again is evidently related to the calling that Jesus Christ makes to Nicodemus. It is the cornerstone and is connected to what the wise and mystical Sufi al-Halal speaks of regarding Caesar, about being myself. It has to do with what St. John of the Cross tells us in one of his letters about the fact that the most perfect degree of perfection that can be reached in this life is the transformation into God, transcending our small self so that our true self becomes complete and present. And in the work of Agustin d'Hipona, in this 10th book, Section 27 of his Confessions, this great man, this great saint, this great person tells us, "Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and so new. Late have I loved you, and behold, you were within me 2000, and I was outside of myself, and from the outside I sought you. You were with me, and I was not with you. Those things kept me away from you that, if they were not in you, would not exist." For certainly, friends, the divinity beats within us. Saint Augustine of Hippo took a long time to realize, which is why he begins by saying, "Late have I loved you, beauty so old and so new. Late have I loved you." But the conviction he arrives at, even if late, is the conviction to which we are called to be supermen. It is the conviction to which we are called so that our soul opens in the expression of Federico Garcia Lorca at once, so that we may be born again in the expression of Jesus Christ and be able to say with certainty, coexistence, and direct experience, "Behold, you were within me, and I was outside of myself, and from the outside I sought you. You were with me, and I was not with you. Those things that kept me away from you, if they were not in you, would not exist." And allow me to conclude these reflections on Garcia Lorca by referencing a poem by someone who greatly admired him, Juan Ramón Jiménez, another great poet, born in 1851, who died in 1958 and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1956. He was born in a province of Western Andalusia, Huelva, in the municipality of Moguer. And notice what Juan Ramón Jiménez, perhaps influenced by this letter from Federico Garcia Lorca to Regino, says in his Eternities, "I am not I. I am not I. I am the one who walks beside me, without me seeing him, whom I sometimes go to see and sometimes forget, the one who remains silent and calm when I speak, the one who forgives, sweet when I hate, the one who strolls where I am not, the one who will stand when I die." When, what a beautiful way to truly refer to what we truly are. What a beautiful way to refer to that true being that exists in Lorca, and that Lorca calls to appear on stage. I am not me, I am not me, I am this one who walks beside me without me seeing him. I am this one whom I sometimes go to see and whom I sometimes forget. I am this one who remains silent serenely when I speak. I am this one who forgives sweetly when I hate. I am the one who walks where I am not, the one who will remain standing when I die. And of course, these reflections of Federico Garcia Lorca, which are also in a relationship of communicating vessels with this precious poem by Juan Ramón Jiménez, lead us to the life and work of Oscar Wilde, because Oscar Wilde proposed and embodied one of the great tools, one of the great instruments we have at our disposal, even if our mind does not like it, for self-transformation, which are the dark nights. So, hand in hand with Oscar Wilde, we are now going to enter into the role of dark nights in our process of self-transformation. I repeat that our mind does not like this, but let's delve deeper. Let's delve deeper into this role of the dark nights, which is a fundamental backbone on the path towards the Overman that Nietzsche presents to us, and for the soul that we are to finally appear, as proposed by Federico Garcia Lorca. Let's go to Oscar Wilde, 2001. Oscar Wilde in mid-1895 was, my friends, indeed at the peak of success and fame. As we mentioned in the introduction, he was born in Ireland, went to England, and there he gained enormous fame. His literary work, his work as a poet and playwright, was at its peak in 1895. Especially the play, The Importance of Being Earnest, had elevated him. He was a successful, famous, and highly admired person, with capability and economic power. In short, Oscar Wilde was at the peak of what, from the perspective of the lion, that lion Nietzsche speaks of, which leaps out to conquer the world, had conquered the world. Oscar Wilde in 1895 was the lion who had succeeded as a lion and had conquered the world. Now, Oscar Wilde had in his life, in his character, in his experiences, the condition of being homosexual. He was not heterosexual, he was homosexual, which obviously has no importance or significance. One can be homosexual or heterosexual, and from a spiritual point of view, this is something irrelevant. However, in the era in which he lives, in that still Victorian England, homosexuality was not only frowned upon, but also punished with imprisonment. And there is an episode in his life that leads to Oscar Wilde being accused of being homosexual. Specifically, friends, I will be brief in sharing this. He is in a kind of meeting where there are many people, and in that meeting, in a corner of the large room where he was, there is someone who says that Oscar Wilde is homosexual. And of course, at that time, I tell you, this could not be tolerated. It is true that Oscar Wilde, who was on the other side of the room, could have remained silent, but he does not remain silent. Instead, he goes towards the group where it has been said that he is homosexual and confronts them, asking, "Who said that I am homosexual?" And there is a person that I have said, and I have said it because you are homosexual. Who says that? A lord says it. A lord with all the importance that they had at that time, and still have, but much more so back then, to be a lord in England. And Oscar Wilde says that he is going to sue him for infamy, for slander. And indeed, there is a trial of Oscar Wilde against the Lord. And in the context of that trial, the Lord, to prove that Oscar Wilde is homosexual and that he has not slandered him, calls his son as a witness. And it so happens that his son is Alfred Douglas. And Alfred Douglas is the lover of Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was indeed deeply in love with Altis Douglas, and Douglas, under the pressure of his father, testified in court that he is Oscar Wilde's lover, thereby confirming that his father is right and that Oscar Wilde is homosexual. In light of this, the trial turns around, and what was a lawsuit against the Lord becomes an accusation of homosexuality against Oscar Wilde. This ultimately means that Alfred Douglas, his lover, is not sent to prison because he has confessed, in quotes, but Oscar Wilde is sent to prison and is sentenced to 3.5 years of hard labor. From there, the fall of the lion, the fall from success, fame, wealth, power, and admiration is absolute. Oscar Wilde falls into hell. He had married Oscar Wilde to appear respectable. He had married and had a son named Yusan. Through this judgment, everything that is his fortune passes to his wife. There is a divorce, and he is left with nothing, absolutely in misery. But it is not only that he is left in misery, he comes to be seen socially as a pariah, as an absolute pariah. And he goes to prison, I repeat, sentenced to 3.5 years of hard labor. Well, after spending more than 2 years in prison, Oscar Wilde writes a letter, which is the one we bring up here, especially for the role of dark nights in the rebirth and in our path of transformation into supermen, so that our soul can open up once and for all. It is a letter that Oscar Wilde writes to Douglas. Specifically, we know about this letter because Douglas received it at the time and kept it, as we will discuss now and have already mentioned at the beginning. Oscar Wilde is writing this letter in 1897. Oscar Wilde is going to die shortly after. He dies in the year 1900. We will discuss it again, 5 years after his death, Douglas. This letter is given to the one who had been Oscar Wilde's editor during Oscar Wilde's time of fame, 2001, and the editor published it in 1905 under the title De Profundis, in reference to the beginning of Psalm 130 from the Old Testament, which starts by saying, I call to you from the depths, O God, hear my voice. I call to you from the depths. And that De Profundis is the title that the editor gives it when he publishes this letter, which is how we know about Oscar Wilde. And what does Oscar Wilde say in this letter to Douglas? Well, friends, in this letter, what we find is a call for forgiveness and gratitude. Although it may seem incredible, after spending 2.5 years in prison, having fallen to the depths, Oscar Wilde writes a very lengthy letter to Douglas. The Spanish edition has approximately 110 pages that we can acquire right now without any problem. And in that 110-page letter, what we fundamentally find from Wilde towards Douglas is forgiveness and gratitude. Forgiveness, why? Because he forgives him from the heart, that's it. Not because Douglas has changed or stopped changing. Douglas is as he will be as he was, but Wilde does not forgive him for him to change, or because he changed for him to change. No, Oscar Wilde simply forgives him. In that sense, it is very similar to the forgiveness that Christ Jesus offers us when he is nailed to the wood, about to expire. Father, forgive them because they do not know what they are doing. And then they stab him in the side when he is already dying. It is not that the other changes. It is not about forgiving him because he changes. No, I forgive you from the heart, and that's it. You do whatever you want. Live your life as you please. Change or don't change. But there is something very deep within me that leads me to forgive you. It is a deep forgiveness. And along with the forgiveness, there is gratitude. Gratitude, friends. Pay attention. There are beautiful paragraphs in the text, many of which I have tried to gather, or part of which I have attempted to include in the text you will receive tomorrow, where he clearly thanks Douglas for what he has done. And why? Does he thank him? Well, notice the simile that Oscar Wilde uses. It is beautiful. I came to tell Douglas, look, Douglas, now thanks to you, thanks to your betrayal, which I forgive you for, I have understood life. I have savored life. And the understanding and savoring of life, the discernment, the deep comprehension that they have provided me, has transformed me. And now I can say what I could not say before in wealth, in fame, in admiration. I did not have a full life. There were many Oscar Wildes, as I said, many Federico Garcia Lorcas who were there moving around, doing their thing, but it was not me. Now, it is me. Now it is me. My soul has indeed been born remembering the expression of Federico Garcia Lorca. And Oscar Wilde expresses this with the following simile. He says, life is a garden. She is entirely a garden. However, the sun makes it so that along its path, the garden has two sides. A bright side, a side that remains in the shadow. A bright side, a side that remains in the shadow. And the garden bears fruit on both sides. In the sunny and in the shady, it bears fruit on both. Until you betrayed me, had only tasted the fruits of the sunny side of the garden, but I had not tasted the fruits of the shady side of the garden. Now, thanks to you, I have tasted it. And tasting the fruits of the dark side of the garden, along with what I had already tasted from the fruits of the bright side, has transformed me. It has transformed me. I have perceived that the suffering, in quotes, in the fall I have experienced has been a moment of initiation. Specifically, Oscar Wilde tells us, the moment you realize is the moment of initiation. More than that, it is the means by which one alters 2009, their past, by which one alters their past. When you realize it, everything you have lived, everything you have been able to experience is welcomed, is embraced with gratitude. Hence the gratitude he also feels towards his ex-lover who has betrayed him. I am grateful to you. Thanks to you, I have savored the fruits of the dark side of the garden, and from there I have transformed myself. And at the end of the letter, we find a kind of apostrophe that Oscar Wilde makes to his former lover. Oscar Wilde tells him not to be afraid of the past. If they tell you it is irrevocable, do not believe it. The past, the present, and the future are nothing but a moment in the sight of God, and in His sight we must strive to live. What I have before me is my past. I must learn to look at it with different eyes, to make God look at it with different eyes. And this profound self-transformation of Oscar Wilde, this forgiveness and gratitude, this savoring of the fruits from the dark side of the garden, not from complaint, but from the deepest acceptance, transforms him. Friends, an enormous self-transformation occurs within him. That is precisely why De Profundis contains many things, but it is an admirable theoretical and practical treatise about the dark nights. And we can ask ourselves who hasn't asked this more than once when hearing about it. And why the dark nights? Why not 2009, the bright days? Why, to be reborn, to begin the path of self-transformation, must one go through what the mind calls evil? Why is this the way? Well, in that sense, many of you know that I like to bring up quotes from two characters. One, with all due respect, more distinguished than the other, but both worthy of reference. One of them is Silvio Rodriguez, the Cuban singer-songwriter who has a song composed in 1969 titled The Chosen One, in which it is said that here, in this life, the terrible is learned right away, and the beautiful costs a lifetime. The terrible is learned quickly, and the beautiful takes a lifetime. And the other character, not only distinguished, but super distinguished, is Juan de Yepes, St. John of the Cross, who in his poem, titled precisely The Dark Night, says, O night that guided us, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that brought together beloved with beloved, beloved in the beloved, transformed, which is the transformation in God that St. John of the Cross speaks of in one of his letters written in prose. O night as a guide, the dark night as a guide, the dark night worthy of being loved, which is what the word amable strictly means in Spanish, worthy of being loved, more than the dawn, more than the bright day. These expressions from Silvio Rodriguez, 2009, and San Juan de la Cruz should make us reflect on the role and importance of dark nights in our path of consciousness and in our spiritual evolution. And in response to the great question I posed earlier about why the dark nights and not the bright days, the answer is very simple. First, bright days be a path of self-transformation. The person, the lion, following Nietzsche's expression, who fulfills all his desires, the person who is successful, the person who succeeds personally, in family, economically, and professionally, and yet, in the midst of success, living the success, realizes that there is something inside him that was like this. There is something inside him that leads him to perceive that he is dead, that he has not yet been born, As Federico Garcia Lorca said, success, and yet the inner emptiness. This has led people to a process of self-transformation, the realization that the bright day, in quotes, understanding by bright day, what this society tells us is to be the winner that American movies talk about. The winner and the loser, being the winner, being the winner. You have to be the winner, not the loser. Well, you are the winner. You achieve everything. You are the lion that has conquered the world. But nevertheless, there is something inside you that tells you that you are empty and that this is not it. And there have been cases, and there will always be, and there are still now, of people who have self-transformed through the bright days. But much more frequently, self-transformation occurs through the dark nights. And the fact that dark nights are more frequent as a path or tool for self-transformation than bright days has its reason. And its reason lies in our mind, because our mind, with its two levels, the higher level capable of glimpsing and attending to the transcendent, and the lower level or concrete mind that is dedicated to the everyday, the routine, the ordinary, is that concrete mind that is functioning all day long. It is based on its functioning on duality, and it classifies everything. It labels everything in a dual manner. This is good, this is bad, I like this, I dislike this, I agree with this, I disagree with this is positive, this is negative. And that mind, falling into the error of judging life, when in life everything has its profound meaning, and there is no need to say this is acceptable and this is not. Everything in life, if it comes into our lives, has a meaning. And the abstract mind, when we use and expand it, can realize this. But the concrete mind cannot, given how it functions, perceive it. And the concrete mind not only remains in that judgment of life, and in that labeling, and in that duality of the positive and the negative, but also, interestingly, computes much better what it qualifies as negative than what it qualifies as positive, which is a kind of masochism. That is to say, the concrete mind does not see the reality of life and labels life in terms of negative and positive, and curiously, from there, it gives more attention to the negative than to the positive. It computes the negative very well and struggles to compute the positive. It is quite a paradox, but it is so. A good example is health and illness. If there is health in my life, as there is, it has a profound meaning. If illness comes into my life, it also has a profound meaning. Both health and illness have a reason and a purpose. This is the reality. But the concrete mind calls health positive and illness negative. But from there, to whom does the concrete mind pay attention? What does the concrete mind compute easily, and what does it struggle to compute? The concrete mind easily computes illness, but it struggles to compute the positive health. In fact, how many of you are healthy? And have you perhaps reflected at any moment today about your health? Have you thanked yourselves and life for being healthy? Have you valued the ability to live this day in its 24 hours from a place of health? No. The concrete mind qualifies it as positive for health. But however, when we are in good health, it goes unnoticed. The opposite happens with illness. When we are in a specific moment, even if it is just a brief moment of being unwell, even if it is just a simple cold, we are aware all day long. We are constantly aware that we are sick. It is curious, this behavior of the concrete mind, which falls into the fallacy of classifying life as positive and negative, which is not the case. But on top of that, he calculates very well what he calls negative, and what he considers positive often goes unnoticed. Precisely for this reason, dark nights play a crucial role in our self-transformation. It is expressed colloquially as if we had sweet juice and sour juice in front of us, orange juice and lemon juice. And to transform ourselves, we can take from either of the two juices. We have to drink juice, but it doesn't matter whether we drink the sweet one or the bitter one. Well, from that point on, let's drink the sweet one, right? But what happens? Our mind, which is the one that qualifies a juice as bitter and another as sweet, our mind, the sweet, the orange juice, goes unnoticed. With what we have, the only thing we see, even though the other is also in front of us, is the sour juice, it is the acidic juice, it is the juice of the lemon. That is why we are drinking lemon juice as a nutrient for our transformation process. Therefore, friends, we must keep this very much in mind. And we must also keep in mind, speaking of dark nights, the fact that we are, friends, in the last times of this human generation. No one knows the day or the hour, but the signs indicate that everything is in plain sight. The signs are indicating that the end of times, which Jesus of Nazareth spoke to us about in the monthly meeting in January, is near. We will dedicate this meeting to the present moment, to the current situation, and to what awaits us in 2024. We will analyze this in more detail. But the truth is that even though we do not know how much time is left in this human cycle, there are signs that indicate it does not have much time left. And therefore your soul and mind do not have many incarnations left. Will this be the last one? I don't know. Will there be one more for us? Could there be another one in addition to one more? Hardly. One or two more incarnations? 3. I would dare to say that it is impossible, given the signs we already have before us. Therefore, our souls do not have many more incarnations left, friends, and we must make the most of this in terms of evolution, in self-awareness, to obtain oil for the lamp, as Christ Jesus said, in order to access, participate in, and enter the new human cycle, the new humanity in a restored earth. We no longer have many opportunities ahead on our evolutionary path that goes back a long way, and from there, many souls have already said, that's enough. Brave souls who choose the dark nights precisely to make the most of life. Choose the dark night, so that this life, once again, is not a life of distraction, entertainment, habitat, or comfort. And the soul chooses, in its free will, by its own decision, 2001 situations of dark nights. Among the miracles of Christ Jesus, there is one that stands out, and it is the miracle we shared. In the monthly meeting of November, it is the miracle where he goes with his disciples and they encounter a man who was blind from birth. And the disciples say to him, Master, this person is blind because of his fault. Do you see that he is blind from birth? So what fault could there be? The disciples are talking about karma, discussing something he did in a previous life that has caused him to be born blind in this life. And Jesus says to him, no, it is not because of karma. No, it is not because of his fault. It is so that the divine may be manifested in him, so that the consciousness to follow the path of divinity may be manifested in him. That is to say, he does it for dharma. He does it as a life purpose. The blindness was born with that dark night as a revulsive, as a tool to extract from this life the essence that his soul is demanding. Welcome to the brave souls. When we talk about dark nights, let us not contemplate them as they could have been contemplated long ago, generations and generations, centuries ago. Is a person who is going through a tough time, who doesn't know what to do, experiencing karma? Well, it is most likely not karma, but rather dharma, meaning that it is their soul that is choosing to evolve, not because it is a rebound from the past, but as a choice in this life to advance evolutionarily in consciousness. And there I like to remember that the Apocalypse tells us, for this reason, because you are lukewarm, I will vomit you out of my mouth. They do not want lukewarmness. The path of consciousness, the spiritual path, is not the path of lukewarmness. It is a deep path, a profound path, and it is a path where brave souls have the possibility and the capacity, by choosing precisely dark nights, to break free from the context of entertainment and distraction, to shatter the molds of their comfort zone, and to contemplate things in life that help them move forward. Therefore, friends, it is not about rejecting the dark nights as the concrete mind tells us, nor is it about falling into resignation. One must resign oneself to what false religions tell us. One must resign oneself and even go further, setting aside rejection, setting aside resignation. One must even go beyond the understanding of the role of dark nights, to stop contemplating them as dark nights. They are experiences. They are part of the garden, as Oscar Wilde says. They are part of the same garden. Yes, sunny side, shady side, but they are part of the garden. Let the analogy of the weather suffice. In this duality we find ourselves in, we say, tomorrow will be good weather, tomorrow will be bad weather. Look, the weather is always what it has to be. That's it. And if it's cold, I wrap up. If it rains, I take an umbrella. If it's hot, I take off clothes. The only thing that needs to be done is, whatever the what may be, what matters is the how of living the what. Oscar Wilde and his De Profundis is wonderful for understanding all of this that we are sharing. And the contributions of Dark Nights by Oscar Wilde, like those of Federico Garcia Lorca and Nietzsche, clearly tell us that we must nourish and vivify our evolutionary process towards being born again. And this, precisely, spiritual evolution, is what drives the life and work of the fourth of our characters, Antonio Machado, whose evolutionary process is propelled in many ways, including the Dark Night. That evolutionary process of Antonio Machado, which clearly marks his life, is reflected in an expression that many of us know, blow by blow, verse by verse. We find it in his famous Everything Passes and Everything Remains, which Serrat made famous when he covered it as a song, right? There, in that passage where everything remains, he speaks to us about this path we must walk, blow by blow, verse by verse, to make that rebirth a reality, which he also reflects very well in his poem titled Portrait. That Superman Nietzsche speaks, that rebirth has to do with a practice called upon by Jesus of Nazareth. What does it consist of? Can it be expressed? Can it be defined in a few words? We find it, friends, in the work of Antonio Machado, in his poem Retrato, where I am, in the good sense of the word, good. I am, in the good sense of the word, good. That's what it's about, friends. Being a good person in the good sense of the word, transforming ourselves, the transformation into God, the presence of our true self, the presence of being in our daily existence, is embodied in being a good person in the true sense of the word, good. Antonio Machado captures it very well in such few words in his portrait. And this being good in the good sense of the word, being a good person in the good sense of the word, carves out a spirituality that, as we also find in Antonio Machado, has two powerful elements: authenticity, which is an undeniable hallmark of Antonio Machado in all aspects of his life, and anti-clericalism, which, interestingly, was partly related to his exile and death in France, specifically in the Occitan town of Cuyul, where his remains are still buried. Because indeed, with the onset of the Spanish Civil War, Federico Garcia Lorca was murdered, while Antonio Machado had to flee into exile, from which he never returned, and that exile had much to do with his anti-clericalism. But that anti-clericalism in no way means, as is sometimes said or written, that he was not a spiritual person. On the contrary, he is a person of enormous authenticity from a spiritual perspective. Notice the description, in this regard, that Antonio Machado makes in one of his prose works, Juan de Mairena, written in 1900 and published in 1936. Antonio Machado tells us the following about atheism. Notice how subtle Antonio Machado's appreciation of atheism is. It tells us in John that atheism is an essentially individualistic position, that of the man who takes as evidence the fact of his own existence, thereby inaugurating the realm of nothingness beyond the boundary of his self. This man either does not believe in God or believes he is God, which amounts to the same thing. This man also does not believe in his neighbor, in the absolute reality of his neighbor. For both things, it lacks the vision or evidence of the other, a strong intuition of otherness, without which one does not move from the I to the you. The atheist is a person who does not believe in God or considers themselves to be God, which amounts to the same thing. A person who is unable to transcend the boundaries of their self, who inaugurates, as Machado says, the kingdom of nothingness beyond the borders of their small self. It is as if Federico Garcia Lorca, established in those Federicos Garcia Lorca, instead of realizing that there is something else, inaugurated the kingdom of the idea that beyond my little selves there is nothing, and of course there is nothing that can be called divinity. It is true that Antonio Machado distanced himself significantly from official religiosity, and this is one of the main reasons for his exile in the context of the Spanish Civil War. The one who has to flee so that they are not killed in the context of the Spanish Civil War. And notice what he tells us in his intimate notes, in his work titled Intimate Notes. I read it literally. Rome is a power of pragmatic. West, a power against Christ Jesus, which has enough of Christ Jesus to defend itself from him, which in no way, friends, is an exaggeration. I believe that this phrase from this distinguished character, taken from his intimate notes, should also make us reflect. Rome is a power of pragmatic the West, a power against Christ Jesus, which has enough of Christ Jesus to defend itself from him. But the spirituality of Antonio Machado is undeniable. In the text that you will refer to tomorrow, I take a series of paragraphs from an article titled The Poetic Religiosity of Antonio Machado, whose authors are José María García Castro and Jaime Inubio. They tell us that for Machado, faith has such public relevance that it is key to the prosperity of any society. To this, we must immediately add the clear differentiation that Machado makes between metaphysical faith and religious faith. And here we have to return to his aforementioned work, Juan de Mairena. Machado tells us in that work a metaphysics that is a more or less daring hypothesis of reason about absolute reality, which is always supported by an individual act of faith. An act of faith, my teacher used to say, does not consist of believing without seeing or believing in what is not seen, but rather believing that it is seen, regardless of the eyes with which it is looked at, and independently of whether it is seen or not. And there still exists a metaphysical faith that does not necessarily have to be as widespread as a religious faith, but nor is it necessarily less. Or why? The intimate adherence to a great rational hypothesis does not allow for any legal restriction on its dissemination within the human species. Such is one of the foundations of our school of wisdom. And this spirituality that Antonio Machado cultivates leads him, as could be no other way, to the demand for a radically coherent way of life, having Jesus of Nazareth as his model and guide. And here I return to Garcia Castro and Nubio, who tell us that for Machado, the reality of Christ Jesus as the founder of authentic fraternal love that leads us to the Father is a recurring idea to express the overcoming of rationalist solipsism. Now I will talk for a moment about what rationalist solipsism is and the essence and essential otherness going beyond personal being. This fraternity is something more than a purely philanthropic relationship in the enlightened manner, as it contains an openness to the transcendent. This is the spirituality found in Antonio Machado, and it is a spirituality that, as we have just shared, takes us beyond that solipsism to which I will briefly refer. Therefore, for Antonio Machado, I now take another phrase from his intimate notes. Notice what he tells us. I have always regarded writing against the divinity of Christ Jesus as a matter of taste, likely and indicative of superficial thinking. Usand is the demolishing eagerness of the pygmies who admit no other stature than their own. But this divinity brings it down to earth. Antonio Machado was a coherent and immensely practical person, and we find this at the end of his Saeta of the Gypsies, where there is no room for doubt, where he tells us, in that Saeta the Gypsies, Machado tells us, I cannot sing, nor do I want to that Jesus of the wood, but to the one who walked in the sea. And in his Proverbios y Cantares, Machado adds, why call paths the furrows of chance? Everyone who walks, walks, like Jesus over the sea. Everything passes and everything remains, but our task is to pass while making paths like Jesus made over the sea. And these convictions of Antonio Machado lead him, as we also find in Proverbios y Cantares, to have a vision of reality that goes far beyond the purely material. In the Proverbios y Cantares, he tells us, that is why I love the subtle, weightless, and gentle worlds like soap bubbles. I like to see them painted in sun and crimson, flying under the blue sky, trembling suddenly and breaking. And from there also, these reflections of Caminante son tus huellas el camino y nada más. Traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking. By walking, a path is made, and when looking back, one sees the trail that will never be walked again. Traveler, there is no path, only wakes in the sea. Traveler, there is no path, and a path is made by walking, blow by blow, verse by verse, just as we said a few minutes ago. And certainly, Antonio Machado encourages us to go beyond that solipsism, which means shutting yourself in your, so to speak, solitude, in your small self, understanding that life is you, and that there is nothing beyond you, the other and otherness. And within that other, also the understanding of the transcendent. And of course, Antonio Machado. And with this, we will conclude our remarks about him to move on to our last character, also mentions these last men we were discussing a moment ago, referring to Friedrich Nietzsche, decades. After Nietzsche, Machado also observes that this is a society that has killed or is killing God. And in his work, The Complementaries, notice what Antonio Machado tells us. The peoples that have reached a high degree of material prosperity. France, Germany, England, Italy, and also a high degree of culture, face a moment of great danger in their history, a danger that only culture can remedy. These peoples come to suffer from a serious amnesia. They forget human suffering. Their civilization becomes superficial, taking on the sense of utility and pleasure. They forget that third dimension of the human soul, the true religious foundation of life, the tragic feeling of it, as the great Unamuno says. They set aside essential problems, and indeed unknowingly paralyze the last springs of civilization. A civilization, friends, that is truly human, is one that cannot leave behind the complete dimension of each of us as beings and existences, as we have said, our transcendent part and our perishable part. All of this shapes what it means to be human. And when we break, when we scratch any of these parts, let alone when what we remove from the midst is our true being, our true and transcendent self, we simply become something else. We become subhuman, and we become these last men that we keep reiterating. And in any case, focusing on what is most substantial. In relation to Antonio Machado, there is another author you will find referenced tomorrow in the text that Kiko will see, which is Alonso Pinto, who tells us about Antonio Machado, that for him, as a heterodox Christian and anti-clerical, the great revolution of Christ was to preach the brotherhood of men, emancipated from the ties of blood and the goods of the earth. In this way, by identifying ourselves through a common father and mother, love, reduced to the exclusivity of the family, extended to the human family. It is another of the great messages from Antonio Machado, so that we do not remain trapped in the narrow circle of compassion that is very, very pygmy, of compassion that is very limited. In that sense, I remember that the teachers have always taught us, Antonio Machado is very aware of this, that compassion can go through different circles. It is like an evolutionary path. The first circle of compassion. Usand is the strictly egoic circle. It is the compassion, if we can call it that begins and ends with oneself. With whom are you compassionate? With me, with someone else, not with me. There is another circle, which is the primary tribal circle, where that egoic compassion expands to embrace not only oneself, but also loved ones, family, and friends. This second circle of compassion can be further expanded. It is the tribal circle of belonging, or the expanded circle. It is the field of action of compassion where it continues to expand, and in addition to oneself and one's loved ones, it also affects other people with whom we have a sense of belonging, whether because we are from the same place, share the same nationality, or have similar interests, etc., etc., etc. Evidently, these first three circles of compassion must be expanded in our evolutionary journey, in the rebirth, and from there a new circle will open, the fourth, which is the circle of compassion for all our human counterparts. This represents a qualitative leap and an immense step, but without forgetting that we still have another pending leap ahead of us. Universal compassion, the circle of complete compassion, and universal compassion, compassion towards all sentient beings, towards all forms of life, stemming from reverence for life. Does Antonio Machado invite us to clearly ask ourselves what our circle of compassion is? A question whose answer we find in the great spiritual traditions, which provide us with the understanding that compassion is either universal or it is not truly compassion, is something else that we are falsely calling compassion. And this compassion, a great teacher of it, was Amalia Domingo Soler, who was not given the title by chance, and is thus known today as the chronicler of the poor. In this final part of my presentation, before taking a break and opening the floor for your questions, we are going to talk about Amalia Domingo Soler, whom we have left for last, not because she is the least known figure among the five we are discussing, but because she serves as a kind of corollary to everything we have been sharing, a corollary about compassion, rebirth, spiritual evolution, and all that it entails. And besides, it is true that she is a little known figure. In fact, Spanish literature barely remembers Amalia Domingo Soler. Despite being, as I already shared with you in the introduction, one of the best writers and poets of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Her passionate and brilliant public and journalistic polemics with clerical sectors, which unleashed all their intolerance against her in an attempt to erase her memory in the decades following her death, explains such a regrettable fact that she is largely forgotten in Spanish literature. In fact, friends, I have no problem in sharing with you that having been born in Seville, Amalia Domingo Soler, being therefore a fellow countrywoman of mine, I was completely unaware of the existence of Amalia until I learned about her through the name of an educational institution in Lima that was named, or had been named when I first learned about it, more than 10 or 15 years ago, Amalia Domingo Soler. And when asking about Amalia Domingo Soler, they told me, but she serves your land. We believe she was from Andalusia, and not only from Andalusia, but from Seville. In other words, it was thanks to an institute in Lima that I became aware of the existence of this great figure. And from there, in this workshop, allow me to contribute a small grain of sand towards recovering and valuing his figure, for which I will start by summarizing something I have not done with Nietzsche, Wilde, Machado, or Lorca, because I believe they are well known enough. But here, I will provide a concise summary of the biography of Amalia Domingo Soler, and from there make a series of reflections on what was, without any doubt, her most extraordinary spiritual contribution, everything she taught us about life after death. He was famous for his dedication to helping the most disadvantaged, with assisting prisoners in jails being one of his priorities, and his renunciation of keeping any type of possessions, distributing everything among the less fortunate, and even selling the gifts he received to meet the needs of others. This is the chronicler of the poor. This summarizes the core of the heart of Amalia Domingo Soler, who was born on November 10th, 1835. The joy of her coming into the world was overshadowed by the possibility that she might have a congenital anomaly that could leave her blind. Fortunately, she never reached this extreme, although throughout her life she struggled with significant visual impairments. However, as we will discuss shortly, the medical attention for her condition opened up perceptions about life that were previously unimaginable for our protagonist. If it hadn't been for her visual impairments, she would not have met the doctor who treated her, and we will now see the importance he had in the course of her life. What Amalia did suffer was the poor relationship between her parents and the frequent absence of the paternal figure who ultimately abandoned the home. This made the mother dedicate herself entirely to her daughter, trying to give her everything within her reach, despite the economic difficulties arising from relying solely on the modest income from her work. And very soon, at the age of 10, Amalia began to show literary interests, and at just 18, she published a series of poems where she expressed her feelings in a simple and tender way. And at the beginning of 1858, several of his poems appeared in the Sevillian magazine Museo Literario. In those years, Amalia was a sad young woman and a lover of nature, who became depressed in winter and delighted in spring with the parks of Seville. During one of her usual walks in the gardens of the Alcazar in Seville, accompanied by her cousin and under the watchful eye of her mother, she encountered a young man named José Alvarez, who offered her a flower, giving rise to the girl's romantic illusions. But he was already promised and remained faithful to his commitment. José's wedding left a deep scar on Amalia, who from that point on never formed a sentimental bond with another man. The death of her mother in June 1860 plunged her into great desolation, but she refused to accept the customs of the time that urged her towards a marriage of convenience with an older man or entering a convent. So what she did was sell her few pieces of furniture and belongings and move to Madrid, hoping for a poor but uneventful life, working as a seamstress. The texts from the time tell us that Camelia was a woman with a small, fragile body, of unstable health and not physically attractive, but she possessed great sensitivity, a very Andalusian character in her language, and at times a lively satirical wit. At the urging of her friend in Madrid, she returned to Seville, although she was so disheartened that she contemplated suicide and her financial situation became dramatic. Amalia also experienced a profound dark night. All these experiences were felt by Amalia from deep spiritual convictions, great anguish in the search for God. She did it within herself and also externally. Temples, images, but she never resonated with so many figures of clay. She never resonated with so many hollow rites and cults. I was engaged in such diatribes when another friend, whom I had met in a modest evangelical temple, arranged an appointment with Dr. Hinser, an ophthalmologist and homeopath, to examine her visual ailment. And as we shared a few minutes ago, it is precisely this doctor who attends to him due to his visual ailments that opens the doors for him. Specifically, this doctor, who was a convinced materialist to top it off, was the one who, during one of Amalia's visits, as she spoke to him about her feelings and what she perceived, told her about people who might be able to offer her the explanations she longed for. According to Dr. Hinsel, they were madmen who claimed such strange things as the eternal life of the spirit, the survival of the soul beyond the body, its reincarnation on earth as many times as necessary for its learning, in order to then go to other worlds and dimensions, and its ability to acquire knowledge and correct all the mistakes made until its perfection. This is what Dr. Hinse, calling it madness, tells Amalia, and from there he indicates that they meet in a respectable house on Cervantes Street in Seville, and that among them were men and women whom he had to acknowledge were 1,000 intelligent people, as well as excellent writers who published in newspapers like the Criterio de Barcelona. From there, Amalia began to read that newspaper, Criterio, contacted these people and also started to publish in the newspaper Criterio. The editor of the newspaper, the editor and director of the newspaper, supported Amalia as she began to get to know her work and her writings. And it began for Malia from that point on, from this door that this materialist doctor opens for her, thanks to the dark night she is constantly going through due to her sexual and visual deficiencies. Malia's life changes. A new world opens up for Amalia as she joins the Spanish Spiritist Society and moves to Barcelona in 1876. There, she always received the affection of Luis Jacques' family, the president of the Buena Vida Spiritist Center, who welcomed her into their own home. From that point on, she multiplied her publications in numerous magazines and newspapers. All these writings are currently being collected in different books. Since it is a lengthy relationship, I am not going to read it, friends. You will receive it in the text that Kiko will send you tomorrow. I want to mention that Amalia also participated in the launch of magazines aimed at women, such as Luz del Porvenir, and became an advocate for women's rights, which were so limited in her time. Amalia stood out, alongside other female writers, in raising her voice to demand that women have the opportunity to pursue all professions with equal opportunities and salaries, independence, dignity, and moral freedom worthy of a rational and responsible being, as well as the right to an education based on a change in the educational system that produced ignorant women, with only the necessary knowledge to navigate the social environment. And despite being very respectful of everyone's political and religious opinions and of freedom of thought, her debates were famous for their rationality and firmness. Amalia began writing for Luz del Porvenir, but this magazine became her property, and she wrote in its pages for 2 decades, directing it until the final closure of the publication in 1900, when Amalia turned 65 years old. But this did not conclude her journalistic task, as Amalia continued sending her writings for publications in much of Latin America, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Mexico, and Argentina. His articles and poems were published in about 30 newspapers and magazines in Spain and Latin America. Indeed, historical consistency tells us that the final stage of Amalia's life was one of sadness. Bernabé Moreda described her as an elderly woman with a contracted figure, shoulders hunched forward, of short stature, very fragile, and a face with deep furrows. That being, with a somewhat grotesque appearance and an aesthetically unpleasing physical form, nevertheless housed a spirit also of an artist, full of tenderness and natural intelligence, dedicated to the comfort of his fellow beings. In a mediumistic meeting, which she regularly attended within the Spiritist context, a spirit told her, a reward earned with your effort. A palm earned with your effort. When she receives this message, Amalia understands and seems to feel relief that everything is fulfilled, and she feels ready to depart, dying of bronchopneumonia on April 29, 1909. The burial took place in the cemetery on the southwest slope of Montjuic in Barcelona, and in the same year of his death, the book Flores del Alma was published as a posthumous work. From all this context that I have summarized, and I wanted to do so, by synthesizing what her life was due to the lack of knowledge about Amalia, what is fundamentally, friends, in what concerns this workshop, worth emphasizing. In a more significant way, 2009, well, without any doubt, life beyond death. Amalia was not only convinced, but she also wrote everywhere about this precisely, about the existence within us of something that does not end when we physically pass away. The conviction that our transcendent dimension is one that has an evolutionary path of reincarnations, which is not just one life, but a chain of lives. And from there, what insists upon us is what, on the other hand, spiritual traditions and great wise men and women tell us, that death does not exist. In this regard, I want to remind you that there are 5 major sources that support what Amalia tells us about the non-existence of usant after death. The first source to consider when we talk about life as a continuum, that life does not end with death, is the teaching of all spiritual traditions, the teachings of all transcendent philosophical schools, and the teachings of all the great instructors who promoted these traditions and schools. It doesn't matter the era, it doesn't matter the geography, it doesn't matter the culture. All spiritual traditions and all transcendent philosophical schools tell us the same thing. And we would have to ask ourselves if they are all wrong, if everyone was crazy. Is it possible that amidst such madness, there is such a degree of unanimity in the deep conviction that life does not end with death, along with traditions, schools, and their instructors? The second source of the 5 that I want to share with you as a reinforcement of the idea that life does not end with what we call death. The second source is provided by the wise men and women of all times, understanding by wise men and women those individuals we currently consider the 1,000 pillars of our civilization. Everyone has been convinced of the existence of life beyond death. We take any encyclopedia and review the men and women who, from not only a spiritual perspective, but also a scientific and philosophical one, have laid the foundations of what we today know as our civilization with their lives and works. And all of them, practically without exception, agree that there is life after death, from Pythagoras to Einstein, passing through Leonardo da Vinci. Is it possible that everyone is crazy? Is it not an excess of ego? That ego which Antonio Machado highlighted when writing about atheism. Isn't it an excess of ego to consider that we know more than all those wise men and women, especially when there is a huge consensus on this matter among those wise men and women? Likewise, and thirdly, as another source that attests to the existence of life beyond death, all oral and written traditions manifested in a multitude of texts, for example, whether we refer to the Egyptian Book of the Dead or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, all of them clearly speak to us that when we pass away, what we truly are undergoes a transition from this physical plane, moving through the transition to the plane of light. Near-death experiences indeed also attest to this as a fourth source. A multitude of people around the world have had this experience of physically dying, the disappearance of the vital signs used by medicine, and after a greater or lesser time, returning to life. Many have compiled them into books, studies, and reports, many of which have been developed by researchers, scientists, psychologists, and neurologists who have experienced and investigated these near-death experiences. And in fifth place, friends, as the fifth source, the people who possess the gift of seeing the disembodied. Because there are people who have this gift, and most of them remain anonymous. It's as if sometimes I have found that life has provided me, has gifted me with the opportunity to meet a significant number of these people who see. It is a gift. Each of us has our own gifts and talents, our innate qualities, and there are people who have this gift, which is a difficult gift to manage, and it is a gift, I repeat, that many keep in anonymity. And these people see the disembodied, they see those disembodied beings who are in transit to the other plane, and are an undeniable source for understanding that indeed there is life after death. Amalia Domingo Soler had the gift I just described, but her rigid and rational upbringing, as happens to many people with this gift, prevented her from fully expressing this ability. His friend Eduardo was the one who helped him to express and develop it. And on one occasion, while Eduardo was in a trance, a spirit communicated its interest in helping her with her task. It was about Father Germán, a deceased priest who became a spiritual guide for Amalia from the other realm, and to whom she owes the title we have already mentioned of the chronicler of the poor. It was the spirit of Father Germán that, by supporting her and guiding her spiritually, gave her this title, considering the compassion and the compassionate soul of Amalia Domingo Soler. So much so that Amalia maintained an intense connection with the deceased cleric, to the point that she published the memoirs of Father Germain, which is precisely a work we have available titled Memoirs of Father Germain. And these memories, I repeat, are conveyed by Father Germain, his spirit, when he had already been deceased for a significant amount of time. In 1912, the memoirs of the distinguished singer of Spiritism were published, which, divided into two parts, present in the first the chapters written by Amalia herself, and in the second, those dictated to her from the other plane by the medium Maria. Thanks to this, and we conclude with this, friends, to enter the rest period and to answer your questions. Thanks to this, precisely, thanks to these memoirs of the distinguished singer of spiritualism, we know that Amalia, upon disincarnating, was awaited by her deceased loved ones to accompany her in the transition. This is what they indicate to us. This is what they show us all these sources that we have just shared. When we pass away, upon disembodying, we transition to the plane of light, and during that transition, we are accompanied by the souls of loved ones who have already passed away and who, to provide us with that light, to give us that warmth in the process of transition, accompany us throughout it. Specifically, we know about Amalia through the connections she made once she had passed away, as her mother, the aforementioned Louis Jack, the editor of Fernández con la Vida, and her friend Eduardo were waiting for her. And Amalia tells us about making another plane, where she perceived how everyone shone brightly, and together they accessed the plane of light. Exactly the same, friends, as what you and I will do at some point in our life process. That moment when we disincarnate, when we make the transition, and like Amalia, access the plane of light along with the souls that accompany us in that process. The works of these 5 characters clearly tell us, friends, that there is life beyond death. And they also clearly tell us to make the most of this life, that this life is not a product of chance, that this life is related to the embodiment of our spiritual dimension in an evolutionary process where fundamentally what we are meant to do is to be born again. That rebirth, going through the phases we must pass from the camel to the lion until reaching the child in the transformation towards the overman that Nietzsche speaks of, knowing that we must transcend our small selves, those Federico Garcia Lorcas that Federico talks about, so that our soul can be born, so that our soul can appear. We know that in that birth, the role of dark nights, although it can also be due to bright days, is enormously significant, immensely, never better said, transcendent. The work of Oscar Wilde, the life experience of Oscar Wilde, makes this clearly evident. It is a path, it is an evolutionary process. The very evolution, blow by blow, verse by verse of Antonio Machado, to which we have referred, is a vivid example. And all of this, of course, with the conviction that there will come a moment when we disincarnate, and that when we disincarnate, we will continue to be alive, because life does not end with death. But indeed, we must have sown, and we must have sown in order to reap a good harvest from the life experience we develop in this incarnation. So let's make the most of this incarnation, especially when we can perceive that we don't have many left. We take a break here, as Kiko has already reflected in the message. From this moment on, you can send him your questions. On my clock, the time in Spain is 20:07. We will take a 10-minute break. At 20:15, we'll meet for Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention. Once again, thank you for your presence. We will see each other in a few minutes.
We are already prepared for the good Kiko, as I am too. Whenever you want to, send the questions. The first one is from Josefina, and she asks, 2001. I understand that in the new humanity, people will finally evolve from joy, and that we can also move closer to that. What a wonderful encounter I just heard. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Josefina, for your comment and also for the observation. It is an observation that I fully share. The new humanity, that new humanity in a restored earth, is well described in various traditions. We have talked a lot in the workshop about Jesus of Nazareth, about Christ Jesus, and in the Christian tradition, we are clearly told how life will be lived in that new humanity. And indeed, it will be a humanity where everything we call pain, everything we call suffering, will no longer exist. Evolution will therefore be from joy. In that humanity, there will be no death. In that humanity, there will be no illness. In that humanity, there will be no violence. In that humanity, there will also be no controversies with us, the kingdom of nature, as it is told in the Christian texts. Man will be alongside the wolf, and the lamb will be beside the lion. There will be a perfect symbiosis among all forms of life, and evolution will therefore come from joy. So, regarding what Josefina shares, I see it exactly the same way, and not just because my heart and soul see it that way, but because what the teachers and traditions teach us tells us that this is precisely what will be. So, Kiko, we can move on to the next question.
Rivas. Hello, Emilio. Can you explain a little more within this framework what non-violence consists of? Thank you.
Non-violence, in one way or another, ahimsa 2001, which is the Sanskrit term used in the collection of Hindu sacred texts known as the Upanishads. Ahimsa is, I say it again, present in all spiritual traditions. For example, in the realm of Christianity, the commandments speak of thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not kill. The concept of you shall not kill in Eastern traditions has a much broader perception because this you shall not harm applies, for example, to many of you who have approached the world of yoga. Within the realm of yoga, in the preparatory phase, what is called preliminary yoga includes living according to what is referred to in yoga tradition as yama and niyama. Niyama refers to things we should include in our lives, while yama refers to things we should prune from our lives. Pruning from our life, and among the things that need to be pruned from our life is precisely the harm, and strictly speaking, to get into the details, living in non-violence, living without causing harm, means that with our actions, our emotions, and our thoughts, we maintain a sufficient vibration within them so as not to cause harm, not only to another person, but to another living being, to another sentient being. And of course, from this perspective, non-violence, the non-harm to Gimsa, encompasses much more. Because even if we don't realize it, when we get angry with someone, we are exercising violence. I say, getting angry does not mean I have to share with someone what I see, which may be different from what the other person sees, and I express things as I see them. But when we try to impose our criteria, when we attempt in some way to force the other to see things as I do, that is when we are practicing violence. Ahimsa includes this non-violence, not falling into this type of practice, not to mention anger, rage, etc. It also relates to nutrition, trying to feed ourselves as much as possible, attempting to nourish ourselves without harming the animal world. I say, we have already shared the animal world in many monthly meetings, because in the animal world, the life forms that compose it have a nervous system more or less developed, but they have a nervous system with the consequent ability to feel pleasure and pain like a human being, which does not occur in the mineral world or in the plant world. So in our daily behavior, in our way, in our lifestyle, in our manner of relating to others, in our diet, these are manifestations of that essence, of that way of living without causing harm, of that non-violence that goes far beyond not killing and even extends beyond the mere perception of not harming human beings to encompass all sentient beings. We can continue, Kiko.
Does Pilar ask how a soul emerges at some point to begin incarnating in different and eternal experiences?
Well, this is a topic that requires a monthly meeting. In fact, Pilar, we dedicated a meeting to it that I believe you can find on Kiko's website. We held a monthly meeting. If I remember correctly, it was around December 2022 or January 2023 to recognize our true being and to become aware of the soul and the spirit. And there, in that monthly meeting, with the attention that the matter deserves, we focus on what the soul is, the birth of the soul, making a kind of synthesis of the synthesis, but without being able to go into detail, because I repeat, it would require a time that we do not have at the moment. The soul is the vehicle that the spirit uses to enter the material world in the universe. Everything that is originated makes up the cosmos, the universe, and within everything that is originated, there is the presence of that which has no origin. That which has no origin is present, immanent, in all that is originated that comes from that which has no origin. Thus, the cosmos and the universe represent a perfect coexistence between that which has no origin and all that has been originated, and there lies that which has no origin. What has no origin is what we call spirit, and what is originated is what we call matter. And the spirit, in order to enter into matter, to experience it, to know it, needs something that in some way resonates vibrationally to be able to descend into the worlds of matter. I call it, as you have heard me say more than once, the soul I call the bathyscaphe. The spirit is the crew member, and the bathyscaphe is what helps it descend into the depths of the material world, where, for example, human life develops. From there, the soul is one because the spirit is one. The soul is one, but it has branches. In that monthly meeting I shared, we used the simile, which is very old, of an inverted tree, a tree upside down. The spirit enters through the roots into the yusan tree, and the tree has the main trunk from which branches emerge. The branches develop twigs, and the twigs produce clusters of leaves or bunches of leaves, and leaves grow from them. The entire trunk, the branches, the twigs, the leaves, all represent the soul, because the soul is one and has a single sap, which is the spirit. The sap is one, the one that permeates the entire tree, from the trunk to any of the leaves. That is what is known as the soul. But this example of the tree is interesting because it tells us that the soul has an evolution. That is to say, for branches to grow from the trunk, for twigs to grow from the branches, for clusters of leaves to grow from the twigs, and for leaves to grow from the clusters of leaves, that requires an evolution. And that evolution is reflected in how the soul begins to emerge. We would say that the soul opens up like a trunk at its beginning, unfolding in a flow of waves of time, with branches appearing, twigs appearing, and finally, the soul leaves. To put it figuratively, the soul leaves are those souls that, belonging to the one soul, just as the leaves belong to the tree, have the capacity to live their own experience, much like what happens to a tree. If we observe a tree, the leaves of a tree, each one has its own experience, depending on where they are positioned on the tree. For example, they have experience of wind, experience of sun, or experience of rain that is different. Each one has a different experience regarding the insects that may be on it. They have different experiences regarding whether birds build nests on it or not, etc. On the tree, each leaf has its own experience. And the soul leaf, that is in the context of the great one soul, which is the great tree, the leaves that appear have the peculiarity of being able to live their own experience. They are the soul leaves. And the souls, like leaves, are those that embody in that descent of the spirit. They are the ones that manifest in forms of life that possess self-awareness, such as human beings. The human being has a consciousness of self, has a perception of self, for there embodies a soul leaf. The enormous tree will not manifest in a human being through a branch. It manifests through a leaf, because the leaf has the possibility of living its own experience, which is what is connected to a way of life with a sense of self. However, a leaf soul cannot incarnate, for example, in an animal. It cannot incarnate in a plant. It cannot incarnate in the mineral, vegetable, or animal world, for the simple reason that there is no self-awareness there. So there, that great tree, which is the one soul embodies from the branch, from the little twig, is what is called group souls. Thus, in conclusion, the soul that is incarnated in each of us has its own experience. It is a leaf within the great soul, animated and nourished by the same sap, by the same spirit, because the spirit is evidently one, even though it is found in each individual. It is like at the center of the soul, as St. John of the Cross said, at the center of the soul, a leaf that has incarnated in each of us. And that leaf soul that has been entrusted to each of us has a very long process that comes from the night, from the times it has been through, because the soul that is now incarnated in me has gone through all that process of group soul incarnation in all the kingdoms of nature, so that it has finally evolved, configured itself to be able to incarnate in a specific human being, in me. 2001, the soul that is incarnated. the leaf soul that is incarnated in me, and the experience of each soul leaf is not developed solely through one personality, but through a chain of reincarnations, through a chain of life. That is what I can share very briefly. However, I tell you, in that monthly meeting dedicated to the soul and spirit, you have all the material, and Kiko has it there in his database at your disposal. Can we continue, Kiko?
Does Francisco Javier ask what it means to be born again in the water?
When Christ Jesus speaks of water, it is important to understand the esoteric meaning of water. First, when it is said to be born of the Spirit and of water, it is to emphasize, that is the first thing, the essence of that birth. It is a birth that is not only spiritual, it must also be real, from the perspective of its physical manifestation. Water is related to our etheric component, and as we have shared in various monthly meetings, our etheric component, also called the energetic component, is like the mold from which the physical body emerges, and from the physical body, our emotional world and our mental world arise. We will say that the etheric is like the underlying foundation of our entire vehicle, of our little self, of our physical, emotional, and mental self, and the personality associated with it. That etheric component, which is the foundation of all of this, is what is associated with water. What we are invited to realize is that for the transformation of being born again to fully manifest within us, it starts from a different way of life, a way of living that is coherent with who we are. We must also be aware that this way of life will nourish us and transform us mentally, emotionally, vitally, or energetically, and physically. When we have referred to the thread of the question raised by Pilar, when we have referred to the soul and at its center the spirit, right, like the sap of the eusen tree, we can draw a parallel to a building. The building would be our body, our small physical, emotional, and mental self, and the personality has been associated with a building, a multi-story building. Let's put it this way, it might be easier. A multi-story building, on the bottom floor is our etheric body. There, above the etheric body, the next level is the physical body. Higher up, we have the emotional world, and even higher, we have the mental world. The mental world would be the highest level of the building. The mental world we have shared has two levels, the lower or concrete mind and the higher or abstract mind. We would say that in our mental world, here is the concrete mind, and here on the rooftop of the building, on the rooftop is the abstract mind. So that is what we are from the perspective of approaching the car, the etheric or energetic, the physical, the emotional, and the mental, and within the mental, the concrete mind, and up on the rooftop, the abstract mind. When our soul and spiritual dimension incarnates, it is as if it rests upon the building. This is our soul and spiritual dimension that incarnates. When incarnating, we would say that the upper part of what incarnates is the spirit, and the soul is the vehicle that the spirit uses to incarnate upon our little self. So, where does the spiritual dimension incarnate? Where does it fit? Where does it couple? In the abstract mind. This relates to what traditions tell us about that very important component of the human being, which includes the pineal gland and the pituitary gland, because that is the physical basis for the consistency of the abstract mind. There, above the abstract mind, is where the spiritual soul dimension is embodied. What part of the spiritual soul dimension, what part of our higher self embodies, or rather embodies all of it? The soul rests more directly here. This is the soul. Up here is the spirit. This is the soul. The soul rests upon the abstract mind, directly embodying the soul and embodying our entire higher self. What is coupled to the abstract mind is the soul, which is what defines the human being. And here, in these two hands that represent the building and the higher self that has incarnated upon the building, this is the human being in perfect conjunction of being and existence, of appearance and essence, of the perishable and the imperishable, a perfect conjunction. And for our higher self to become present, it is necessary to be born again. And the rebirth implies not only a way of life, which of course relates to who we are, but also going beyond that. It is necessary for something here to open so that the qualities, the attributes of our higher self, the qualities and attributes fundamentally of the soul, which is what is in contact with our higher self, can permeate us. This is what is called, friends, the sacred rain in esoteric terms. And the sacred rain in the process of being born again is what harmonizes, balances, shapes, and fills with light both our mental world, our emotional world, our physical world, and our vital world. This is referred to as the rebirth of water and spirit. The spirit is related to presence through our works, through our behaviors, our conduct, and our fruits. By their fruits you shall know them, through our works. And the transformation is not only spiritual, it is also of water, in the sense that I insist on calling water the etheric, which is the foundation of the physical, emotional, and mental. It is the transformation that makes our mental abilities more organized and more balanced. The abstract mind that opens up and has the capacity to access the transcendent, a more serene emotional world, a calmer emotional world, a healthier physical world. This does not mean that illness does not still have to come to us in this humanity, but illness is already experienced in a different way, because the focus is not so much on the what, but on how the what is lived. And in any case, whether sick or healthy, there is in us a vitality and a vital force, thanks to the influence of the spirit on our etheric body, on our energetic or vital component. This refers to being born of water and spirit. It is something related to behaviors and conduct, so that what we truly are becomes present, and also the assurance that as we do this ourselves, we are transfiguring, transforming, filling ourselves with balance, filling ourselves with harmony, 1001, all the components of our little self. This is referenced, apart from what we have already shared, that being born again not only involves transcending our small self, but also realizing that this world is not ours, as we shared in the first presentation. We can continue, Kiko.
Rodrigo, in relation to so many noble souls that do good, like those you mentioned today, and also seeing so many involutive beings that do evil, is there a sort of balance between good and evil in the universe or in the physical plane? Just as we currently see so much dystopia and darkness, a corresponding level of luminous actions is generated.
The answer to the question is simple. If we turn to what spiritual traditions and philosophical schools have taught us, what prevails in the universe is order. Order is why it is called cosmos. The word cosmos is a term that comes from classical Greece. And what catches our attention, 2009, is that the universe has an order. It is not something that arises by chance. It is not something that happens randomly. That which has no origin is the source of all that is originated and is present, immanent in all that is originated, as we have said regarding spirit and matter. And as that which has no origin is the source of all that is originated carries the impulse of that which has no origin, specifically, as astrophysics states, from its fluctuation. The fluctuation that gives rise to the cosmic infraction from which the Big Bang emerges, leading to the universe. It is the word that spiritual traditions speak of. It is Christ, ultimately, in the Christian tradition, and it is the Om that Eastern traditions refer to. That which has no origin, through its vibration, is the source of all that is originated. From there, everything that is originated has the impulse of that which has no origin. Everything that is originated has the impulse of the same primordial principle. And precisely for that reason, since everything that is originated has the impulse of the same principle, it precisely has an order that we could call a natural order. It is what Augustine of Hippo, whom we cited in the first part of this meeting, calls the order of love. It also has to do with what is called the Tao in Eastern traditions. Who hasn't heard of the Tao? The Tao is precisely due to the fact that there is a primordial principle that drives everything, meaning that the universe, life, existence, in the small and in the large and in the small, has a meaning. It is a path, which is what the word Tao means. It is a path, and that path signifies a destiny, and that path signifies a meaning. Life, the universe, existence, the cosmos, has an order, has a path, has a destiny, has a meaning. Meaning and destiny have the same letters, and it is not by chance. That is what traditions indicate to us. And the term Tao makes this very clear and is very useful for responding to Rodrigo, because when we see the symbolic representation of the Tao, what is the Tao? It is a circle, but it is a circle. Tao, by the way, is a word from ancient Chinese. Well, Tao is a circle, and that circle has a white part and a black part. But they are both part of the same circle. It is a way. We are called 2001, to break the duality of the mind. Let us not look at life, existence, the cosmos, not through the prisms of concrete thinking. The black and the white, no, because the black and the white are part of the same. They are part of that circle. And that circle has its white part and its black part, but both are within the circle. And to further emphasize that we should transcend dualities, in the white part there is a small black circle, and in the black part there is a small white circle, to completely break the schemes of duality. What is being said to us with this? We are being urged to consider the idea that all of life, existence, has meaning. Now, when it comes to embodying it within the circle that has meaning, when it comes to embodying it, one can live, and you and I can live, aligned with the meaning of life or against the flow of the meaning of life. Evolutionarily, aligned with the meaning of life, sensibly, aligned with the meaning of life or against the flow of the meaning of life. That is to say, unsensibly, involutively. And what does this mean when applied to us? Well, to live against the flow of life is to live in service of myself, me, and me, and me, or me and my own. Those circles we referred to earlier, greatly reduced. Here, what matters is me and my own, the person who believes they are the center of the universe. The earth, no please, the earth is clearly not the center of the universe, but I am the center of the universe. From there, selfishness, egocentrism, materialism, harm, and suffering for those around us inevitably arise as a consequence of that foolishness, as a consequence of going against the flow of life. That is what is involutive. But we can also live. It is what we are called to do, in fact, because it is living in coherence with who we are, which relates to that life that has meaning. It is to live aligned with the meaning of life, which means a way of living that is altruistic, generous, bringing out the best in ourselves, as Antonio Machado says, being a good person in the best sense of the word. In the context of the cosmos in general and in the context of human life in particular, we encounter both things. We encounter the evolutionary and we encounter the involutionary. The evolutionary helps the evolution of life in a natural way because it is aligned with it. And does the involutive help? Well, it does. Why? Because the involutive, while it does not justify involutive behavior, generates dark nights, creates pain, and causes suffering that, interestingly enough, can serve to push elements in life that are indifferent or lukewarm to take a step towards the evolutive. That is why I like to say that evolution, the evolution of consciousness, is like a train, because it moves along two tracks. The track of the evolutionary, which clearly advances towards something because it is evolutionary, but also the track of the involutionary. Because the involutive originates situations within ourselves and even in the environment. They do not justify the pain that I cause, but they do create the appropriate scenario for there to be frogs. Speaking metaphorically, that in the face of the heat generated by pain and suffering, leap forward. And if it weren't for those heatings, they would remain there in their comfort habitat without making the leap. Therefore, the evolutionary and the involutionary are part of life. They relate to free will, the meaning of life that drives that which has no origin and is not a mandatory direction. We can live in alignment with the meaning of life or against the flow of the meaning of life, but the Tao is such that everything ultimately nourishes everything ultimately leads towards the evolution of life. But I repeat, this does not justify the one who, by putting themselves at the service of their own interests, causes pain and suffering. That the Tao is capable of transforming that into evolutionary substance does not justify that pain and suffering. In fact, and ultimately, and with this I conclude my response, Rodrigo, What we are told is that from a soul perspective, when we align ourselves with the involutionary, we are called to disappear, to dissolve. In this context, speaking from a soul perspective, they are like souls that begin to rot because they do not bear fruit. And that soul decay is not that anyone does it. It's not that anyone punishes you. It's not that anyone subjugates you or anything like that. No. If from the soul's perspective, we distance ourselves from life, we end up losing our vitality. If you distance yourself from life, you have the right to go against the flow of life. But if you distance yourself from life, you are inevitably pushing life away from you and will inevitably lose life, not in a physical sense, but in the soul and spiritual sense of the expression.
We can continue, Kiko. Yuri, these wonderful people left marks on humanity. We could say that they were evolved spiritual beings who came to leave us messages of love, support, and to help us be reborn in life. They came for Dharma. They came to support us at the beginning of the century to emerge from darkness. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Yuri, for your observation, which I fully share. Yes, my conviction is that in those historical moments, also now, but in those historical moments, it was essential for great souls to make their presence felt, to deliver a message in a very special context. Keep in mind, as we shared in the introduction of this workshop, that these souls all incarnate in the 19th century, with the first chronologically being Amalia in 1835, but from there, they all continue to incarnate throughout the 19th century. The 19th century is a striking moment in human evolution because it relates to what is called the beginning of the times of desolation in the Christian tradition. The beginning of the times of desolation are the same evils as always, but with more intensity than ever. This is precisely what happens starting from 1870, 1880, coinciding with the incarnation of these souls, with full incarnation, because these souls are already acting, they are already showing their potential, in the way we discussed in the first part of this workshop. And I insist, these are moments in which the Industrial Revolution in its waves has already fully manifested. The ever-increasing demographic explosion has been set in motion, and the usual ills are beginning to acquire a magnitude like never before. The evils of always with more intensity than ever, which is what happens throughout the late 19th century and into the early 1970s and 1980s, up to the final stretch of the 20th century, where, as we have shared in other monthly meetings and workshops, the so-called times of tribulation begin. The times of tribulation are the evils that always exist, with more intensity than ever, but they are new evils that humanity has never faced before. And that is what we have been experiencing since the end of the 20th century, the same evils with more intensity than ever. It continues to happen, but in addition, new evils that humanity has never experienced before arise, such as, without any doubt, the use of something wonderful like technology, but from the perspective of control, monitoring, domination, numbing, and abduction through the screen, etc. It is a typology of evil, in quotes, that humanity has never encountered before. Well, these souls embody they embody at the outset, in coexistence, with the times of desolation, with the beginning of the times of desolation, and the initial development of those times of desolation. And there are some of them, such as Nietzsche and Machado, who clearly warn us about where we are headed by killing God, those last men we have referred to. And therefore, dear Yuri, friends, of course, these 5 souls were and are noble souls. They are great souls and embodied at that very pertinent moment, going through difficult times, because the 5, as we also shared at the beginning, did not have an easy life and indeed faced enormously tough personal circumstances, as we have also shared. Nietzsche dies in dementia. Oscar Wilde dies in ostracism, in absolute misery. Federico Garcia Lorca is murdered. Antonio Machado is exiled. Amalia Domingo Soler dies in the midst of ignominy and a multitude of de facto powers that try to make her memory quickly fall into oblivion. But their mark, that mark to which Yuri refers, has remained within us. And a good proof of this is the context. It is what we are sharing in this Christmas workshop. Let us take advantage of the legacy of these souls not only noble, but also these brave souls who embodied to leave us a testimony, to leave us a teaching, both with their lives and with their work.
We can continue. Bene? Hello. I remember reading Nietzsche in my high school philosophy classes, and it left a very deep mark on me. In fact, it was a great crisis, a significant internal confrontation, and I remember that besides the death of God, he spoke of an eternal return, something that intuitively conveyed to me an idea of transcendence and spirituality. My professor asked me about that eternal return, but he couldn't answer me. Perhaps you can tell me something about this. Thank you very much.
Well, it is an enormously powerful topic, theoretical, but with huge practical repercussions. So much so that one of the themes I am reflecting on to introduce in the monthly meetings of the upcoming course, one of the monthly meetings for the 2024-2025 course, is dedicating it to time, the study of time. What is time, and what implications does it have for us? Because we are used to seeing time linearly, right? I won't go into detail about linearity now. That linearity, which physics until recently considered as absolute time, is now regarded as relative time since the theory of relativity. The different observers may see time in different ways, but they do not perceive time as a straight line. Now, there is another vision of time, which is circular time. In this context of circular time, what has been conveyed to us by spiritual traditions is a circle that advances in a spiral. That is to say, time is cyclical, it moves in cycles. There is a movement. All movements are cyclical. The cycle of day and night, the cycle of low tide and high tide, the rotations of the earth around the sun. There are constant cycles, permanent cycles, and everything is like a circle. It is not a straight line. The entire universe, all of life, is speaking to us about time, movement, and time moving in circles, but these are circles that involve evolution. They are not circles that repeat, but rather circles that, while turning, are advancing upward. Regarding that, possibly because it has many practical implications, we will dedicate a monthly meeting to it in the upcoming course. When we talk about eternal return, the eternal return is a concept that does not belong to Nietzsche. It is a vision that does not belong to Nietzsche Usand, but to Stoic philosophy, to Stoicism, which believed that life is truly a circle, but it is not a circle that ascends in a spiral. No, it is a circle that repeats. It repeats. It's like Groundhog Day, like the movie Groundhog Day, in which everything that happens in the universe and in your life will repeat exactly the same. This vision, as far as I know, has been maintained by very few schools throughout history. One of them is due to Stoic philosophy, and Nietzsche refers to this. But Nietzsche, why does he refer to the eternal return? One must read him, one must go to the gay science, one must go towards Zarathustra, one must go to the work of Nietzsche. And when we read Nietzsche's work, Nietzsche is not telling us that time is what the Stoics say. No, he is using that as provocation. He is using it as provocation. If you read Nietzsche, Nietzsche tells us to imagine that everything that is your life would repeat in another life, and another life, and another life, and another life. Suppose there is a demon, Nietzsche tells us. It is the example he gives, almost literal words, that there is a devil who at night approaches your dreams and makes you see that your life will be eternally repeated. Imagine following Nietzsche. Imagine that your life, the one you have been living for a number of years and the one you have left to live, when you die again, you are reborn in the same character, with the same experiences, exactly with the same lived moments. We would be talking about Groundhog Day, the famous movie, but not just a day, rather the life of the groundhog, a life that repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats. And from there, Nietzsche asks us, in light of this vision, what do you feel? Reflect on it. In the face of the possibility that eternity is the life you are living now, exactly the same, repeated, ask Eternum, what is being stirred within you? If what is being removed is panic, if what is being removed is the fear that this is the case, be careful, change your life, pay attention, change your life. It is the litmus test that your life is not going in the direction it should. On the other hand, if there is something in you that when you hear that your life will be an eternal repetition, the life of a groundhog of your current life says, hey, well, look, I am living this life fully. I am living it in the abundance that I would say is spiritual, which is by no means material. I am living it with fullness. Therefore, if eternity consists of living this full life eternally, then welcome it. Is the eternal return a provocation, Nishano, which is what your teacher Yusan couldn't explain to you? It is a provocation from Nietzsche, a stirring from Nietzsche to tell you that you don't realize that you have to live differently. Because what happens to 99% of people is that when faced with the scenario of repeating this life over and over again, they become panicked. Well, if you feel panic at the thought of repeating this life over and over again, it means that you are not truly living this life, you are not making the most of it, you are not experiencing it fully. This is what Nietzsche refers to with the eternal return. I already told you that I had a bit of a plan to dedicate a monthly meeting to time, to the study of time, with all the spiritual and everyday implications that this appreciation you have suggested to me has motivated me to decide. So let us have a meeting in the next course dedicated to time, and among many other things, we will talk about the eternal return. Well, nothing, Kiko. We can move on to another question, Angelica. What would essentially be the difference between being a good person, in the good sense of the word, or being the very best, magnificent? The conscious action of being a good person, always maintaining a high vibration. Also means, Angelica, that sometimes you have to know how to say no. Being a good person does not mean going through life saying yes. I say this because I believe it is well understood with this example. Conscious action, the one that comes from what we truly are, means maintaining a high vibration from moment to moment in our behavior, in our conduct, and in our attitudes. And maintaining a high vibration does not mean going through life saying yes, 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 because that turns you into a camel. With that, you are not a child, you have taken a step back, you have become a camel, someone subordinate, submissive, saying I have to. No, no. The creator, the child that already is, the child that has embodied conscious innocence, the child that has creative capacity, that child must have strength from a high vibration, not the lion that rushes in to fight. From a high vibration, it must have the strength to know how to say no. One must have discernment to know when to say yes and when to say no. That is something Buddhism does not understand. Buddhism is always about putting on a good face, saying yes no matter what. No, no. You have to empower yourself. You have to love yourself. As Christ Jesus said, love yourself. Self-love is the commitment to your true self. May that empower you. May that manifest the presence of what you are. And from that presence of your true being, cease to be born again. What does that presence of your true being mean? There are times when you have to say yes, and there are times when you have to say no. There are things that are done, things that are not done, this yes, this no. And everything we do, whether it is a yes or a no, we should always do it with that high vibration. Buddhism will never understand this, because Buddhism is ultimately not empowerment, it is weakness. You are really not being a good person. You are being a bad person, because you are settling for whatever reasons, whether it be misunderstood education, belief systems, weakness, or cowardice. And that has nothing to do with being a good person. Being a good person, I insist, is knowing when to say yes, knowing when to say no, saying yes when it is appropriate, saying no when it is appropriate, doing it or not doing it when it is appropriate to do it or not do it. And yes, to do everything with that high vibration that the teachers demand from us. Let's continue, Kiko.
Adriana, good morning from the state of Baja California, Mexico. Why separate the Virgin Mary when mentioning Jesus of Nazareth? Is it really necessary to have an entire workshop to talk about her and the philosophers who were influenced by the Virgin?
Without a doubt, the figure of Mary, in quotes, the Virgin Mary, is colossal, absolutely colossal. She is an extremely important figure for understanding Christianity, and as we are well told from Lower California, as Adriana rightly points out, there is no doubt that she has influenced and has influenced greatly throughout the history of humanity. For me, it certainly has great importance. From the perspective of the concept, I know that there are many people who, when the virginity of the Virgin Mary is mentioned, do not believe it. Well, I am not surprised that in a society that has killed God, there is talk of someone having a virginal conception, and that breaks the paradigms of a materialistic society. If I share with you, in line with what Adriana has raised, I share that in spiritual traditions, especially in the oldest ones, I would say the purest ones. So to speak, this is perfectly explained. It is explained from the perspective that when a soul incarnates, that soul we spoke of earlier, the first manifestation it has upon incarnating is the etheric body, because the physical body emerges from the etheric body. The etheric body serves as the mold for the physical. Thus, the first manifestation of the soul's incarnation is in an etheric body. And when the soul incarnates, it uses the etheric substance of Mother Earth, because Mother Earth is a living being and has a physical body, but it also has an etheric body. And when the soul incarnates, the soul's dimensional and spiritual aspect, which we previously mentioned as resting 2000 in the building, the soul, upon incarnating, first does this, with the etheric substance of Mother Earth, as if the soul were a potter, allow me the analogy. It shapes the little vase that will become its etheric body. That is to say, in the vastness of the etheric substance of the earth, the soul takes a little bit of that etheric substance from Mother Earth and shapes 2000 the etheric body upon which it incarnates. And that is the first manifestation of your soul, of mine, of all souls, when they incarnate in this plane. An etheric body that is supplied by Mother Earth. The substance is provided by Mother Earth. The potter is the soul that, based on dharma, karma, its life purpose, etc. From the soul agreements, it shapes the little vase you sand in one way or another, but the substance is provided by Mother Earth. Once this has occurred, it is with that etheric body that the soul becomes present in the womb of the mother after fertilization has taken place, and with fertilization and the process of gestation, the physical mother provides the genetic materials that overlap like the pieces of a puzzle mat, and the puzzle mat is the etheric body, while the pieces are the genetic components, cells, etc. That in the womb of the mother, the physical mom provides and overlaps onto the etheric body. Does the human being really have two mothers? The earth, which is rightly called Mother Earth because it provides us with the etheric body, and our physical mother, who provides us with genetic, cellular elements, etc. Well, from there, what does the virginity of the Virgin Mary mean? What I have shared is that when there is an etheric, the etheric becomes present in the womb of the mother. Once fertilization has occurred, the soul, upon incarnating, reaches a soul agreement with what will be its progenitor and progenitress. One agreement among the three one time that the soul has incarnated. Here it already has its etheric incarnation. In sexuality, the sexual relationship between these two, the fertilization by the father and the mother, leads to pregnancy, where the etheric body becomes present, with the mother providing the genetic material. This is what happens in most cases, but exceptionally, when the soul is a very powerful soul, traditions tell us that when the soul is very powerful, it may happen that the soul makes an agreement with the progenitor and the progenitress. That soul agreement exists. The soul incarnates, using the etheric substance of Mother Earth to create its little vase, the vase of its etheric body. But the soul has such power that it is capable of entering the mother and initiating the gestation process in the mother without there having been a sexual relationship with the father. The father, so to speak, is a father in name only. He is a soulful father because there has been a use and agreement, but physically the father does not act. It is the soul itself, due to its greatness, that has the ability to initiate the process of fertilization within the mother. And it should be noted that we are told in the Christian texts that in one of the Gospels, the angel announces to Mary her virginal conception. But in the other Gospel that speaks of this, it is Joseph who is informed in a dream, in a lucid dream, where it is told to Joseph that he will be a father without there having been a physical relationship. He will be a soul father because there is a soul agreement among the three souls. The super powerful one, which is the soul of Jesus, and the soul of Jesus, when it has an etheric body, has the capacity to initiate the gestation process directly in Mary. I repeat, this sounds like something out of 2009 science fiction in the society we live in. However, this is esoterically documented in ancient traditions and has, if you reflect on it, an enormously powerful spiritual significance. What the figure of Mary also highlights, as does that of Joseph, is that they must have been two immense souls, two very complete souls, with the only difference being that the soul of Mary accompanies Jesus throughout his public life, which the soul of Joseph did not do because he passed away earlier. The soul of Mary even survives physically, outliving that of Jesus. Mary remains alive when Jesus has already disincarnated and ascended to the heavens. That said, and to conclude the response to Adriana from the most concrete point of view, at this moment, Jesus of Nazareth tells us, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the way. Christ is the way. Christ is, so to speak, the North Star that guides us. His teachings, his life, his work, there it is, his messages, his rebirth. He is our guide. He is our orientation. But we are here, and this must be done step by step. It must be done. The path, that is Jesus, the way that is Jesus, it must be done step by step. This means, to put it in a way that sticks in your memory, that Christ is the way and that Mary is HIV. Christ is the way and Mary is VIH, meaning the path. Christ is the way and Mary is the path. So of course Christ is always with us. I bear witness to that. Certainly Christ is always with us. But in Mary, we can find a more everyday companionship, a more direct companionship. Jesus experiences a dark night, certainly, of course, but Mary experiences a super dark night. She had to survive the experience. She had to live through the experience of her son's death in martyrdom, in slander, in torture. And the soul of Mary is an immense soul. It does not have, so to speak, the level of what is the soul that was able to receive the Christic, which is the soul of Christ Jesus. The soul of Jesus of Nazareth, which thus transforms from Jesus into Christ, does not reach that immense magnitude, but it is a soul of enormous power. And its role is fundamentally one of what should not be, but must be. It is that daily companionship. It is that loving motherly support. It is that companionship we sometimes need in the most difficult moments. Christ is always with us, but that tenderness, that sensitivity, that delicacy, that way of being present, in the deepest connection with our pain, with our suffering, with our adverse circumstances, we find in Mary friends. So there are two figures evidently that complement each other on a soul level. I am not making comparisons. The soul that incarnates in Jesus of Nazareth has such power that it allows for the precipitation of the Christic, but the soul that incarnates in the Virgin Mary is a master soul without any doubt. And hold on to this simile of way and vium, because with every step we take, the Virgin Mary is always accompanying us. And the proof is that Jesus, when he ascends to the heavens, tells us, I will return. Yes, I will return. And he is going to return without any doubt. It is the second coming. But Mary has a daily presence. And in fact, the Marian apparitions, some of which are more consistent, and some that are not as much, but there are many true Marian apparitions, many that are reliable, highlight that companionship, that bio of Mary to which I am referring. Thank you very much, Adriana, for the question you have raised from Lower California. Greetings to the friends in California. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to study there at the University of Berkeley. They were different times. They were much younger then. A big hug.
Shall we continue, Kiko? Olga, Emilio, has Lorca's homosexuality influenced his spiritual awakening? Or in his case, does it have nothing to do with it? Thank you.
Yes, it had to do with it, because homosexuality, as we have shared, was present in Lorca, and it was also in Oscar Wilde, and in both. In Oscar Wilde, it is very evident due to his work De Profundis, but we also find it in the work of Lorca. In both, it caused a lot of suffering. Homosexuality has been persecuted. Homosexuality has been slandered. Homosexuality as a human behavior that is absolutely, in quotes, natural. Heterosexuality and homosexuality, this from the dogmatized religions that attack homosexuality throughout the life of God. In quotes, there have been heterosexuals and homosexuals. Let's go back to ancient Greece, for example, to classical Greece. We will analyze the studies and contributions regarding the great Pythagoras, the great Plato, and the great Aristotle. This stigmatization of homosexuality is ridiculous. On the contrary, it is the use of homosexuality by those who dominate this system to turn it into a mess, a confusion that no one even knows what it is anymore. This is already a utilization. It is a removal from its place of what inherently has its place, and homosexuality in human life has its place. Oscar Wilde and Lorca experienced it, and they also lived through being persecuted, being slandered, and that caused dark nights for both of them. In the case of Oscar Wilde, in De Profundis, it has become very clear, but in the case of Lorca as well, that dark night which for him meant living homosexuality represented a spur, it represented a trigger on his path of consciousness. In fact, I cannot provide certain evidence regarding this, but there are sources that maintain the idea that Reginio Saiz de la Maza, to whom Federico Garcia Lorca wrote the letter we have reproduced here from the year 1922, was the lover of Federico Garcia Lorca. And Federico Garcia Lorca opens his heart to his lover, revealing that hollow soul, that soul that has yet to be born, which we have read so beautifully in the words of Federico himself. So indeed, Federico's homosexuality was a driving force and played a role in his conscious process, in his evolutionary process from a spiritual point of view. Let's continue, Kiko.
Beatrice, thank you very much, Emilio. It may not have much to do with the topic, but it is a great opportunity to ask you what you advise regarding the dogs and cats that live on the street. For whatever reason, it makes me very sad, and I do what I feel, which is to take care of 3 little dogs and 1 kitten that we have at home. But I feel very sorry for those on the street. How can I handle it in a rebirth? Thank you very much.
Well, me too, dear friend, me too. Lola, my wife too. We live close to each other with 2 little dogs and 2 kittens, which makes our coexistence with them complete. But near where we live, on the outskirts of Seville, there is a place where a group of kittens is located, and well, we go there from time to time, especially Lola, to give them food. When we spend time at a beach near Seville, at Punta Umbria Beach, specifically at the Punta Umbria jetty, there is also a large colony of cats, and we like to go there to bring them food and other supplies. That said, from my own experience, it is not something I speak about, because someone told me. I live it. They have the capacity for life, that is to say, they have their vital habitat capacity. These kittens that are living in those communities, let's call them that, whether in urban areas or in more natural settings, have that capacity. With that, we also have to be aware that even if we do not bring them food, even if we do not feed them, they have the ability to find their own food, they have the ability to find their shelter, and they have the capacity to protect themselves from the harshness of the weather. They are not foolish. They are very intelligent forms of life, and I can say this from first-hand experience because I live it, I have lived it, and I will continue to live it with complete clarity. Does this mean we should neglect her? No. What we can do from time to time is to approach those groups, for example, not only to provide food, which may be the least important, but especially to give affection. They feel that the presence of humans is not a hostile presence, because they are group souls, souls that are advancing in the group realm, and when a leaf soul gives them love, when it gives them affection, it is marking them, helping them in their evolutionary process to transform into leaf souls. Do not forget this when we talk about our behavior towards animals. If what animals see in us is something hostile and violent, in some way we are hindering the evolutionary process of those group souls towards soul leaves. If what they perceive from us is love, if what they perceive from us is affection, the opposite happens. And having said all this, when we speak in general, not only about what has been shared in the question, but about the animal world, in light of the tremendous pain that nature is suffering, in light of the tremendous suffering that the animal world is experiencing, we must take into account doing the utmost we can, because otherwise we will break. That is to say, it is impossible. The same happens in relation to human suffering. You and I cannot encompass, we cannot alleviate. All the suffering that humanity endures, all the suffering that the animal kingdom experiences. From there, The fact that we feel pain for so much animal suffering and so much human suffering is a sign of evolution. It is a kind of dark night that we are living through. When an evolved person in their compassion realizes the amount of pain that exists in humanity, the amount of pain that exists in the realms of nature, that is something that bleeds within us, well, it is part of the dark night that is in turn a trigger for the evolutionary process. And we must be aware that we cannot encompass everything in order not to fall into the madness that Nietzsche experienced, and to avoid a kind of despair. We must measure our strengths and alleviate suffering to the extent that we can. That saying we have repeated so many times in the monthly meetings. Do the best you can. Of course you have to do, but do the best you can, because if not, that doing will not be sustainable and we can break. And in order not to break, we have to cover as much as we can. Furthermore, as the saying goes, he who grasps too much holds on to little. Let's continue, Kiko.
Luis Alberto, in the new humanity, will people only be able to eat vegetarian food and there will be no need to feed on animals, while animals will continue to kill each other, or will they also be vegetarian?
Well, according to what is narrated in the Christian texts, which provide more detail on the subject, human beings will not need to feed, meaning that neither humans nor other forms of life on the restored earth will require sustenance. Humanity in the restored earth will not have need, pardon, will not have death, will not have illness. What is said to us about his diet has much more to do with prana, with nourishment through prana, than with the foods we currently use. And in the case of animals, something similar happens. Of course, it is clearly stated that animals will not eat each other. Of course, humans are not going to eat animals, but we are also clearly told that animals will not eat each other. This paints a picture of a scenario that seems to give us the idea of nourishment from the kingdoms of nature through the force of life, through prana. We continue, Kiko.
Carlos, did these souls design in detail their experiences on the spiritual plane, in the space between lives that you have explained, to navigate the dark nights according to their evolutionary processes, and also to express them through literature as a submission to humanity?
Yes, it could be. Could it be that those souls brought with them in their life purpose, once they return to incarnate from the plane of light, what Carlos is telling us? Yes, it is perfectly feasible. Carlos, thank you for your contribution. Let's continue, Kiko.
Beatriz, hello Emilio, thank you very much for this meeting. I loved learning about the spiritual thread of these authors that connects us with the Christ event. Could you explain a little bit the phrase that Jesus says, "I am the Son of Man"?
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I believe it can be explained briefly and profoundly. Christ lived use and like you, Beatrice, as I am called to live. He lived as we are called to live, as we are called to live individually and collectively. The expression Son of Man is the fruit of the human being and the fruit of humanity. Fruit understood as what we are called to give, in you and in me and in humanity as a whole, is the 2000 seed of that fruit. That fruit which Jesus already manifested in his real life on this plane and on this planet, that is what he calls the Son of Man, that compass, that future in the unfolding of the present moment to which we are called to do, to bring into presence what we truly are. The Son of Man is like the fruit that we are naturally called to bear, and he already made this evident in his life in this realm. Let's continue, Kiko. I leave it in your hands. I no longer know how many questions might be pending, but we can answer a couple more if that sounds good to you, and then conclude.
Okay. What do you think about the exorcisms of Father Pio and other beings of a high spiritual level?
Well, they seem like experiences to me. Recently, Lola and I have studied Father Pio a lot, and he is a person who evidently is a great soul. He has an impressive potential, and the exorcisms are real. I do not say that all exorcisms are real, but certainly when great souls like the one embodied in Padre Pio speak to us about exorcism, they are speaking to us about a reality, and that reality I know is very harsh. I know it seems a lot like a horror movie, but it has to do with the presence of involutive beings among us and the interferences of those involutive beings. And the best way, as all these great masters have taught us about exorcism, is to maintain a high vibration, because an involutive being can affect us when we are low on defense. And the lowering of defense does not mean anything biological in this case, but rather refers to what has to do with our vibration. If we maintain a high vibration, involutive beings are repelled. On the other hand, if we open breaches due to our low vibration, which can be experiences of drug addiction, addiction to one thing or another, things that harm us from the perspective of altered states of consciousness that create gaps for malevolent beings to penetrate us, well, this leads to a series of circumstances that exorcism experiences like those of Father Pio clearly highlight. We move on to the last issue.
I am trying to choose the most interesting ones. Having already shared about the fascinating figure of Amalia and her deep connection to spiritualism, what is your personal opinion on this intriguing doctrine or practice?
Maria Antonia. Spiritism, as I perceive it with the utmost respect, for all opinions and all ways of seeing things, I do not possess the truth. But I understand that Spiritism had its place at a specific moment in human evolution. Notice that we are talking about the entire spiritualist movement, including Amalia, which is related, as we mentioned before, to its emergence in the 19th century. And we have talked about that 19th century. The 19th century was a very harsh century because it was the so-called age of reason. But it was an irrational reason, as it opposed and denied the transcendent, blinding itself with materialism. And science completely distanced itself from spirituality, a situation that is increasingly changing today. And in those moments, there is a great divorce between science and spirituality. Science accuses spirituality of superstition, first element. Second element within spirituality, what existed were increasingly dogmatized religions in worship and ritual, leading to a growing number of people who found that unfulfilling. Thus, you see, there are two very serious problems: a science that strays from spirituality and turns into superstition, spirituality that has become dogmatized and reaches fewer people each time. This is where spiritualism comes into play. Spiritualism was like a kind of voice in the desert at a very specific moment, so that we do not forget that there is more, And if we analyze the history of that time, we find many historical figures with names and surnames who had distanced themselves from the spiritual, but who, thanks to spiritualism, returned to the spiritual. I am thinking, for example, of none other than Valle Inclán. Thanks to spiritualism, they regained the memory that there is something more after this physical life. Now, having said that, it is also true that spiritualism, if you confine yourself to it, if you dogmatize it, in quotes, you close the doors to all wisdom. My humble advice is that whatever the school, whatever the current, that for whatever reason, due to our circumstances, due to our path, captures our attention the most, we should not close ourselves off to other contributions. True wisdom is the perennial wisdom that has always been called so. It is the wisdom that sees wisdom in all traditions, at the core of all religions. Not in what those schools, those religions, those traditions have become, but in what is there as a true message. That is where we must turn. And this also relates to spiritualism. What I see in spiritualism today, as in many other things, in quotes of spirituality, is that they become excessively dogmatic, believing only in a certain truth, the truth of I don't know who or I don't know what. We need to have a more open spirit when we talk precisely about spirituality. And having said this, friends, it is already close to 21:30. I know this because I have read Kiko's message, and I am also seeing it in the chat, that there are many questions that remain unanswered. I greatly appreciate your participation. It is completely impossible for us to attend to all of them. I greatly appreciate your interest, and it has been a true pleasure to share this extraordinary Christmas workshop on this day of the Innocents. As I have done regarding the time, I will take your contributions into account for the upcoming monthly meetings. We will also try to include some of these questions in the sections for answering questions at upcoming monthly meetings, and from there, enjoy immensely, with awareness of what the end of this cycle is and the beginning of the new annual cycle. May the new annual cycle be an opportunity to, with perseverance, moment by moment, during the same 1000, make rebirth our own. And in that context, I invite you to meet on January 11th. It will not be the first Thursday of the month, but the second this time, due to the Christmas holidays. I invite you to continue sharing on January 11th, and in this case, to change our approach a bit, although the underlying theme remains the same, to discuss the current moment of humanity and what awaits us as conscious reflection, both personally and collectively, for the year 2024. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you very much to all. And as always, thank you, dear Kiko. A big hug. Happy New Year.
Thank you, Emilio. I wish you a good end of the year and a great start for you and Lola. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to continue collaborating. A hug and thanks to everyone.